This audio presentation of I Hear a Voice, a biography of E.G. Fricker the Healer by Maurice Barbanel is brought to you by audioenlightenment.com, copyright 2013, all rights reserved. Chapter 1, Because of a Voice. The thousands of sick people who have been cured by the healing powers of Edward George Fricker owe their benefits to a voice who has guided him since childhood days. In a sense, he could be called the male Joan of Arc, for it was this voice which made him realize that he was born with a destiny to fulfill. There is nothing mystical, eerie, or odd about the solid figure of 15-stone, dark-haired Fricker. To the uninitiated, he appears to be a matter-of-fact, shrewd businessman, a Londoner with a typical sense of humor. They would never believe that he was entirely influenced in early life, as he still is, by this supranormal happening. To outward appearances, he seems a normal family man who enjoys his home life. His diet is conventional and simple, what he regards as good solid food. He has no leaning towards vegetarianism, neither is he a non-smoker nor a total abstainer, though he is tolerant towards those who prefer these ways of living. His is the gospel of moderation. The television and occasional visits to the cinema provide his entertainment, and he has the constant joy derived from a happy marriage. It took many years before the voice made him realize that his life must be dedicated to utilizing the divine gift of healing with which he was born. He can recollect the first time he heard the voice when, as a child of 5 in the street, it told him to take another direction from the one he proposed. This urging surprised him, for the altered route was twice as long. But the voice was compelling, and he obeyed, as he always has done since he has learned to trust its guidance. There was nothing out of the ordinary about his upbringing or his early adult life. Fricker was born in Highgate in North London in 1910, the 7th son of a mother who had 9 children, 8 boys and 1 girl. When he was 4, the family moved to Tottenham, still in North London, where he now has his healing sanctuary. His father was a machine minder at the printing plant which used to produce the Old Daily Chronicle. Young Fricker had the usual elementary school education of the working class to which he belonged. His father wanted him to be apprenticed to the printing trade, but though young Ted reported daily from the time he left school at 14, there was no room for him. For a year he worked in a shop selling shoes, but his yearning ambition was not enamored of the prospect. Several of his brothers were in the butchering trade. As this seemed to hold more chance of promotion, Ted searched advertisements in local newspapers until he found one offering a job as a butcher's roundsman. He applied, was engaged, and started work on the following Monday. By a curious coincidence, when he returned home that night, there was a letter asking him to report for duty in his father's firm, but the die had been cast. 6 months later, promotions came. He was made an assistant cutter. There followed a variety of jobs, all in the same trade, until he was appointed a manager. The rest of his early career is prosaic by comparison with his healing mission. He married in 1935. Their first child, Derek, was 2 years old when Fricker was called up for military service. A second child, Rita, was born during the year, and a third, Teresa, arrived in 1948. Fricker went right through the war without a scratch. He was one of the army under Montgomery, which liberated France, and he finished his war service in Germany. The connection with food was maintained in his military career. Since he was a child, his mother had always insisted on his learning cookery. Fricker ended his war service as a sergeant catering advisor. Returning to civilian life, he was confronted with a problem. Meat was rationed. There was little opportunity, especially as new staffs were not required, in the butchering trade which had been a living for years. With 2 children to support, it was essential for him to find a lucrative job. He made a prolonged study of advertisements in a newspaper, and it was the voice which told him to apply for one that he thought unsuitable, for the advertisement announced that a production manager was wanted for a glass factory. Because he had learned to obey the voice urging, he answered the advertisement, was interviewed, and to his amazement was given the job in an industry concerning which he knew absolutely nothing. He had to learn how glass was mirrored and decorated, and prove successful. Here it is necessary to pause and consider what the voice meant to him. The first time he heard it, he was frightened, simply because it was audible to him, yet nobody was there. Moreover, the voice had always insisted that he was not to tell anybody, not even his parents, because he would be misunderstood, and he might be sent to a mental home for treatment. It is a male voice, he told me in an answer to my question, and he usually hears it in his right ear. Though soft, it is clear, beautifully modulated, speaks slowly but with an authority that compels him to listen. In his school days, when his fear of the voice had not quite abated, he said to two children in his class when it had just spoken to him, "Can you hear it?" The boys looked at him as if he were crazy. For young Ted, their behavior was a confirmation that he had to keep quiet about the mystery voice. Regularly and persistently, however, it gave evidence of guidance and protection. Once before crossing a road, it requested him to stand still, and an accident was averted. It always urged him to help other children in trouble. In his youthful mind, he began to think it was the voice of God communicating. He knew it could not be devilish because of its constant insistence on his being unselfish. Occasionally he was tempted to tell his wife Grace about it, but the voice always warned him to say nothing. It revealed its supernormal knowledge even in small and seeming trivial matters. Often sitting with his mother, whom he adored, Ted would say, "Aunt is coming soon." The surprised mother would reply, "What on earth made you say that?" There has been no word from her. Soon there would be a knock on the door, and the aunt had arrived. The family began to think he had an uncanny fortune-telling streak. Those who now look at the radiantly healthy figure of Fricker, so full of vitality, suggesting a man with a bent for athletic pursuit, will find it hard to believe that for 6 years, until he was 22, he had a long succession of illness, several operations, and seldom knew what it was like to be healthy. He was a victim of influenza, rheumatic fever, periodontitis, and was ruptured. He had a nervous breakdown. Sometimes he was so ill that he could not work. This, he realizes in retrospect, was a preparation for his healing mission. He had to endure the agonies and pains caused by illness so that he could have compassion for others in similar straits. During the war, while he was on active service, his beloved mother became seriously ill. She was afflicted by an internal malignant cancerous growth. Because of their long and tender relationship, Fricker suffered because his mother was tortured by pains that made her cry out night and day. She was a Quaker who had reared her family on its religious principle. Mother taught them that it was essential to say their prayers at night. "When you pray to God," she always said, "let it come straight from the heart. That is what God wants to hear." According to her thinking, church-going was not important. As a Quaker, she believed in the practical application of religion to help others who were in trouble. Because his wife and baby had been evacuated to the country while London was a target of air raids, Fricker's leaves were always spent in his mother's home. Her condition being regarded as medically incurable, no hospital would have her as an inpatient at a time of acute staff shortage. For about 18 months she had to bear the agonies caused by cancer which reduced her ample frame to an emaciated, skeleton-like figure. On these visits she frequently made a strange request. Would he put his hands on her? Fricker, however, was afraid to touch her in case by so doing he produced more pain. Now he realizes that she was a natural psychic, aware of his innate healing gift. He did not do as she asked simply because he could not understand the reason for her request. Besides, the voice was silent. Time after time, while he sat by her bedside watching her suffer, he prayed that one day he might be able to help others who were similarly tortured by pain. Little did he know how his prayer would be answered. His mother's prolonged illness made an indelible impression on his mind. When she died in 1941, he was relieved because it meant the end of her agony, but he was heartbroken. He tasted the bitter grief of bereavement. Death, however, was not the end of her story, for she too had a mission to accomplish. Now we must retrace our footsteps to March 1946, because the owner of the glass factory where Fricker worked was a German. He was not allowed to travel abroad. Fricker was sent to Belgium to buy some essential materials. There he saw an entirely new method of decorating glass. On his return to London, he told his employer that a fortune was to be made by this new process. They must be the first in Britain to utilize it. Kilns were bought and installed, girls trained as artists, and in 3 months it was obvious it had a tremendous and profitable success. Indeed, after 2 years, his employer announced that he had made enough money and wanted to retire. Because Fricker had been the means of his acquiring the wealth, the employer offered him the newly equipped factory without cost. The voice promptly urged him to accept. Thus he was launched as his own employer in a lucrative glass decorating business. Fricker thought that his commercial life was secure. He was to be a thriving, prosperous businessman. Destiny, however, had other plans for him. End of chapter. Chapter 2. A Locket Moves in Midair. The turning point came unexpectedly in 1952 with a dramatic and unexpected happening. It was almost midnight. Fricker sat in bed with the electric light switched on, following his usual practice of making notes concerning work to be done at the factory the next day. Grace by his side was fast asleep. Casually he looked up and was stunned by what he saw. One of his most treasured possessions was a gold locket bequeathed to him by his mother. Inside it was her photograph and that of her husband. Fricker always carried the locket in a jacket pocket. When he changed his suit, he transferred the locket into one of its pockets. As usual, he had left the jacket with its locket in a room downstairs. Now when he looked up from his bed, he saw the locket floating around the room. Moreover, it glided in mid-air as if held by an invisible hand. I must be going mad, he thought. He closed his eyes, opened them, and the locket was still there. It moved towards him. He heard a click, made by it being opened, when it stopped in front of him to reveal the two photographs. Then slowly it floated out of his sight until it vanished. Fricker can remember thinking that nobody would believe him when he related this experience. Moreover, he felt that if he went to sleep without doing something about his weird experience in the morning, he would regard it as a dream. He hesitated as to whether he should rouse Grace, but something stopped him. If the locket had vanished by the time she awoke, he mused to himself, then she would not believe him. He did the next best thing. On his pad he noted exactly what he had seen, so that instead of trusting to memory the following morning, he would have the assurance that it really happened. Though the experience lasted for only a few minutes, it seemed to have taken hours. Recalling this extraordinary happening, he says he was thrilled, not scared, but bewildered as how it was possible. As he could not sleep, he lay there trying to puzzle it out. Could the voice explain it? He asked for help. The answer came, "It is your mother." She held the locket. The confused Fricker replied, "But she is dead." "No," was the reply, "she is not. Her spirit lives on. Today she has heard the news that you can start to use the healing gift with which you were born. She was so excited that, just as a mother would do on earth, she wanted to be the first to tell you. You will get confirmation through another person." These words were clear but meaningless to Fricker. Though he believed vaguely in some kind of afterlife, he knew nothing about conscious survival after death. Neither had he any intimation of any healing gift. Finally sleep came. In the morning he ran down the stairs, and there of course was a locket in his jacket pocket. After much hesitation and deliberation, he decided to tell Grace about the strange happening. She listened intently, and when he had finished, commented, "You must be going crazy to talk about things like that." Her skepticism did not daunt him. "I know most people would say that," he answered, "but it happened, and I have a slight idea of its meaning." Mark you, he had nothing to say about the voice, for still he had been told it was to be his secret. For 2 days a bewildered Grace could not dismiss the strange story her husband had related. Then she remembered that her next-door neighbor had the reputation for being odd. What she did not know then was that they were spiritualists. Something made Grace decide to relate her husband's experience to her woman neighbor. She listened, and to Grace's surprise did not dismiss the story. "It must have been his mother wanting to contact him," she said. This made Grace answer, "What are you talking about? His mother has been dead for years." The neighbor tried to explain that there was life after death for every individual, but Grace's skepticism persisted. She did, however, proffer the neighbor's explanation to her husband, to whom it made sense because of what the voice had said. The neighbor told Grace, "If you want to know more about spiritualism, there is a famous medium coming to give a demonstration at the local library hall in 3 weeks' time. Why don't you go?" When Grace repeated this information to her husband, instead of being scared, as would have been his normal reaction, he was excited and anxious to go. The 3 weeks could not pass quickly enough for him. The day of the meeting came. It is so etched in his memory that Fricker recalls it was a Thursday. He closed his factory earlier to ensure that he would be there on time. Before leaving, however, he had a momentary panic. "Come with me," he begged Grace. She was reluctant, but finally was persuaded to accompany him, though she made the proviso, "If it happens to be crazy, I will walk out." The Frickers arrived in the hall that was soon packed. Joseph Benjamin, the medium, who was to demonstrate his powers, had earned fame for his remarkable clairvoyance. With native caution, in case there was a collusion, Fricker had not told his neighbors that he and his wife were going to the meeting. The Frickers sat attentively as the medium began to give clairvoyance. They were electrified by Benjamin's second message. He announced that his psychic vision enabled him to see on the platform beside him a woman who he described in detail. This description of his mother, said Fricker, was more perfect than he could have ever given. Moreover, said the medium, this woman has a most unusual name. It is Fricker. She wants to give a message to her son in this audience. The medium's gaze was transformed from the platform to the audience. Then he pointed straight at Fricker and said, You are her son. Your mother has come to tell you that you have a great healing gift. To the Frickers, this was a revelation, but the medium had not finished. The mother was determined to prove her identity. One of her proofs consisted in telling the medium to relate a trivial happening, but it was one which made it unmistakable that she was communicating. Did her son remember that when she cooked, he invariably dipped his bread into the gravy? The boyhood happening was all too familiar to Fricker. That was not the end of her communication. First, Benjamin repeated her words, that within a few weeks, Fricker would have, through another medium, all the confirmation he needed about his healing mission. Then came a prophecy. There had been a recession at the factory. On the way to the meeting, Fricker had told his wife that he was concerned because he did not know where the next order for glass decorating would come from. You are not to worry, was the mother's message. At 2 p.m. tomorrow you will get an order, and from that time on you will never look back. The next morning Fricker decided to put this prophecy to the test. He telephoned all his customers, but only one could promise an order. Even so, he did not know when it could be given, because the glass which was to be decorated at Fricker's factory was still at sea. Nevertheless, at 2 p.m. that day, a van drove up to the factory and delivered the glass. After the orders followed with such frequency that the recession was over. Fricker was fascinated by the sequel to the locket that had mysteriously moved in midair. Now he was determined to find out more about the whole subject. His inquiries revealed that there was a small spiritualist church in his vicinity which held Sunday evening service. He decided to visit it. On that Sunday, 2 of his brothers with their families had come to tea. Presently he announced, I am sorry, but I must leave you. I am going out for a couple of hours. When they wanted to know why, he told them this strange story. They were still skeptical and tried in vain to dissuade him from going to the church. Very well, then, finally said the brothers, we will come with you for a lark. No, replied Fricker, I am serious about this. The 3 brothers went to the small spiritualist church, which seated only about 75 people. The visiting medium was a little old lady. What happened is an experience that Fricker will never forget. He even remembers her name, Mrs. Turner, though he had never seen her before or since. There came the important part of the service when Mrs. Turner was introduced to give clairvoyance. She stood up and surprised her hearers by saying, I must warn all of you tonight that I have been sent here to give only one message to one person. After I have delivered this message, I am told that I will never give clairvoyance again. This announcement made Fricker think, just my luck, one of the regular tenants is going to get the message. Feeling depressed, he lost interest in the proceedings. He was, however, jerked upright when Mrs. Turner pointed to him and said, You are the man I want. I have been sent to tell you that you will be a second Harry Edwards. The message conveyed nothing to Fricker. He asked people nearby, Who is Harry Edwards and what does he do? They whispered that he was a famous spirit healer. Mrs. Turner was not finished. I have to tell you, she said, to read in the Bible the words contained in Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. When Fricker returned home, he eagerly turned the pages of his Bible and found the text read, Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. This he realized was the promised confirmation. Fricker knew then that the rest of his life had to be dedicated to utilizing his healing gift. He knew also that it would not be long before he must give up his factory. He read the text several times that night, then he determined to experiment with healing. Do we know someone who is ill, Grace? He asked his wife. She thought for a moment and then said, What about Teresa? Their 5-year-old daughter had been born with a score of unsightly warts on each hand. Her parents had spent pounds in vain effort to get rid of them. Come here, Teresa, said Fricker. He held her hand for 5 minutes. When he removed him, to his bitter disappointment, the warts were still there. The next night, when he came home from the factory and sat reading the paper, the voice said, Look at Teresa's hands. Fricker replied, No, what's the use? A few minutes later, when Teresa came into the room, he said to her, Show me your hands. She produced them, saying, Here you are, Daddy. Look, they've all gone. Every wart had disappeared without a trace or blemish. End of chapter. Chapter 3. The Great Decision is Made. Fricker now had his first conclusive proof that he possessed the gift of healing and that it was directly linked with a mysterious voice, both part of the pattern that had been operating all his life. Naturally, it was a tremendous revelation to him, and he did not know what steps he should take. He had an inner feeling, however, that the voice would guide him. Obviously, if you have a healing gift, you must use it on the sick. But where was he to find patients? He could not stand out his house and shout, "I'm a healer who wants treatment." Now, he could, of course, advertise in local newspapers, but even if he got results, he would not know what treatment to give them. For the time being, he put the problem out of his mind. Destiny, however, unfolded the next step. Going later than usual to his factory one morning, he was crossing the yard prior to entering his premises. He saw coming towards him a girl who he happened to know and who worked in one of the nearby factories. She told him that she had been compelled to ask for permission to absent herself for the rest of the day. Her migraine, which had troubled her for 20 years, was so unbearable that she could not work. Periodically, although she had tried all sorts of orthodox remedies that had been prescribed, she had 3 or 4 days' agony with which were unfit for employment. Fricker wondered, in view of his success with Teresa, whether he could help. The voice told him to take her to his office and hold her hand for a few seconds. Then he was to give her this message. At 5 p.m. you will feel a curious tingling up and down your spine. This will last for a few minutes. After that you will be cured. Fricker hesitated. It sounded too good to be true, and not unnaturally he felt diffident about obeying the instruction. The voice insisted. Rather nervously he did as he was told, the girl looking at him as if he were confronted with a creature from outer space. The sequel was surprising, but just as the voice had forecast. She came running around to his office later that day to say that she had experienced a strange tingling he had mentioned, and thereafter her migraine had vanished. It was worth recording that, although this happened 8 years ago, this woman has never since been troubled with migraine. Fricker was rightly jubilant. One healing might have been a coincidence, but 2 healings made it a certainty that he possessed the gift. Now where was he to find his third patient? Naturally, these 2 tremendous events in which he had been the central figure were a topic of lively conversation for Fricker's family and relatives. One of his brothers, a manager of a cooked meat factory, was skeptical, but suggested that an experiment be tried on a colleague. In his early manhood, he was a very active sportsman. He had apprenticed to a builder and strained his back while lifting bags of cement. Gradually became more and more crippled until he could only walk sideways and look like a hunchback. He could not even bend to tie his shoelaces and was now able only to do a little work at the factory. Yes, he had tried everything. He had spent about 1,500 pounds on doctors, specialists, and osteopaths without any improvement. They could do nothing for him. For nearly 20 years, because of his spinal trouble, he wore a plastic straitjacket. This was in no way curative, but it was thought it should provide some support for his spine. He arranged to see Fricker, who realized that he was now being presented with a crucial challenge. Could this healing gift succeed in this dire case where orthodox medicine and osteopathy had failed to produce even any alleviation? He did not have to wait long for the voice to direct him to put his hands on the patient's back and to make slight rubbing movements. The incredulous visitor admitted that there was some improvement. The voice told Fricker that it was necessary for the patient to come once more. After the second treatment, the voice announced that Fricker could tell him that he was now cured. Hesitantly, the healer transmitted the news. The most, however, that the patient conceded was that he felt very much better, but he wondered whether this might be a flash in the pan. He decided to wait and see whether the improvement was permanent. His immediate reaction was to make a test. Could he do things that had hitherto been impossible? He found to his surprise that he was able to lift a 30-pound tray of sausages for the first time in years. Being a cautious man by nature, he waited 2 years to make sure there was no recurrence of his trouble. At the end of that time, he was satisfied and told the story of his cure to his local newspaper. "I work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week," he said. "I am now as fit as a fiddle. In the 2 years that I have waited before saying anything about it, I have thoroughly tested myself. Now I can do all the things I used to do when I was 17 before the trouble started." Again and again, when you read newspaper accounts of successes achieved by these means, you find the results ascribed to faith healing, in my view a completely erroneous description, as I shall later prove. This man's cure cannot be attributed to faith healing. When he was asked to visit Fricker, he simply did not believe that any healing was possible through him, or indeed anyone else. Now it was no longer necessary for Fricker to look for patients. He was receiving the best of all advertising, word-of-mouth recommendation. In the years that have passed since Fricker began his mission of mercy, he had never once had to advertise for patients. The news of his healing powers was being related by the last 2 cured patients to relatives, friends, acquaintances, and tradesmen. Fricker was bombarded with the distressed pleadings of sufferers for whom the doctors could do no more. It is a striking commentary on Britain's welfare state, with its almost free National Health Service, that there continues to be an increasing army of incurables. Despite all the advanced medicine it is said to have made, there are, alas, thousands of sick people for whom drugs, pills, ointments, lotions, potions, and surgery prove unavailing. I do not intend this to be a wholesale criticism of the medical profession, which contains so many dedicated doctors who are doing their best, while frequently overworked, trying to deal with afflictions that are beyond their resources. Civilization, with all its stress and strains, seems to produce a growing number of new ailments or variations of old ones that will not yield to orthodox remedies. Confronted with this inescapable fact, it is surprising that official medicine should oppose unorthodox methods, such as spirit healing, which does produce results, even with those who seemingly are doomed to die in pain and misery. It is true that healers like Fricker are usually approached by patients only when all other means have failed. The successes, therefore, are outstanding and would be multiplied 100-fold if sufferers came to them in the early days instead of when they were informed their cases were hopeless. Bombarded by telephone calls, letters, and personal applications, and with people knocking at his door, all pleading for help, Fricker tried to cope by giving healing in his spare time. From the beginning, he decided that he would make no charge but would accept voluntary contributions to help pay the expenses incurred. The spare time of his evenings and weekends proved insufficient for the stream of patients clamoring for help. Fricker decided that the only way to deal with this demand was to devote 3 mornings a week to his healing. He and his family lived at the time in a small house, one of a row of 11 dwellings, in 40 Howard Road, South Tottenham, which has nothing to distinguish it from other streets in the sprawling, thickly populated district. The front sitting room, about 12 feet square, was used as a healing sanctuary. It contained typical furniture plus a radiogram. Its most important piece of furniture was a piano stool, which became the healing couch during treatment times. Nearby was a bowl filled with water, so that Fricker, as his voice had told him, could wash his hands before and after every treatment. For 2 years he devoted these 3 mornings a week to the healing, but the ever-increasing number of patients presented a problem. So many had to be turned away or refused simply because he dare not encroach any further on the time needed to run his factory. The inevitable decision had to be made. The factory must go and healing become a full-time mission. It was a wrench, of course, for a middle-aged man to abandon the commercial career on which he had set his heart, but the cures made him realize that he had a destiny to fulfill by utilizing a divine gift with which he was born. Fricker disposed of his factory. The sitting room became the permanent healing sanctuary. Rita, his elder daughter, acted as a secretary to deal with the mail which came not only from all over Britain, but from many parts of the globe. Now the Fricker family had to live in cramped conditions. The teeny kitchen became the dining and living room where Grace Fricker coped imperturbably with domestic problems, meals, entertaining, and her children's friends. The front sitting room could be used only at nights, and mostly then by their son Derek in connection with his architectural studies. The problem was finally solved in 1960 when the Frickers went to live in a newly built house in Hadley Wood, Herts. The ground floor of the Tottenham dwelling was reconstructed so that it could be used entirely for healing. Walls were knocked down up to provide a large waiting room. The kitchen was rebuilt to make it a healing sanctuary. A full-time secretary was engaged, a caretaker and his wife were installed upstairs. Fricker was now ready for whatever fate had in store. End of chapter. Chapter 4. Launched on his mission. It was inevitable that Fricker would receive publicity because of the astonishing results he obtained, and it was inevitable that the first accounts should appear in his local newspaper. Those connected with the press are by nature skeptical, cynical, and hard-bitten. They are not easily convinced. They work in a profession where, if they are to succeed, they must ensure that their facts are right. It is drilled into everyone associated with the editorial side of the newspaper that they must check and recheck their stories. The penalties for inaccuracy are not only disrepute, but can lead to costly libel actions. When the first news of the Miracle Man in their midst reached the Tottenham Weekly Herald, it was decided to put Fricker's power to the test. Without disclosing his professional interest, a man connected with the editorial department came and offered himself for treatment. The result was published under the headlines, "Can This Man Work Miracles? Amazing Story of Healing." The account began with the words, "Every day for the last week, a middle-aged businessman, whose offices are not 2 minutes' walk from the Wood Green tube station, has been getting more and more puzzled. Something ought to be seriously wrong with him, but it isn't." It describes how, as an experiment, he had received treatment from Fricker and added, "As each day passes, and he is still in far better health than he has a right to expect, he is wondering, quite seriously, whether he has in fact been cured of his serious and long-lasting complaint." The patient, who was called Mr. X, had suffered for more than 10 years, readers are told, with severe stomach trouble, which was caused by a duodenal ulcer. Until the time he visited Fricker, he dared not eat any food rich or anything fried, and no alcoholic drink was permitted. The penalty for breaking this rule was swift and certain pain. 2 years earlier, during Christmas, he was tempted to abandon his strict regime and eat a real dinner. For 3 days afterwards, he had to stay in bed. Mr. X, accompanied by a photographer, had treatment lasting 5 minutes from Fricker. When it was over, he was told that he could go home and eat fried eggs, bacon, and any food that he liked. Said the newspaper report, he did so. He has had all the food which he has denied himself over the last 10 years, roast pork, apple pie, and butter pudding. He has not had a touch of pain from that moment to this, and he is feeling remarkably well. In the same account, the reporter told of an interview with a cured patient, Stanley Bishop, age 55, of Claygate, Surrey, who said, "For years I suffered with back trouble. I was told I had 2 slip discs. When someone suggested I should see Mr. Fricker, I told him not to be silly. Eventually I did see him, and after he had performed, this is Bishop's own words. He told me to take off my supporting belt. I was frightened at first, but I took it off and have been all right since. I play golf like a fury now." The account, after describing how Fricker discovered his gift, ended with these words, "Now Mr. Fricker wants to prove his ability outright. He says if 50 people with slip discs gave their names, you can send them over here one evening and I will cure them all. If there are more than 50, we will try to hire a hall." So why was Fricker so confident? Experience had taught him that he could specialize in speedy cures of slip discs and ulcers provided there were no other complications. He had learned something about the invisible cooperators who form part of the healing band in the spirit world. That, however, is for another chapter. What was the result of the publicity in the local newspaper? The answer is to be found in an account it published a fortnight later. It was written by a reporter who began by confessing she was skeptical when she stood at the doorstep of Fricker's house one Friday evening awaiting an answer to her knock. She had never before met a spiritual healer, nor had she consciously desired to meet one. As a reporter, she was there to report on what had happened to some of the patients who had given appointments as the result of reading the first story about Fricker. The reporter admitted that she was intrigued because some of the reports of cures came under the heading of miraculous. As she stood there, she felt she was knocking on the door of another world, and she was. In a small room at the back of the house, she met some of the patients awaiting treatment. Though there was an absence of coughing and sniffling, for this was a November night, the atmosphere was similar to that of a doctor's waiting room. In the air was a feeling of optimism and cheerfulness. Everyone chatted in a friendly way. The reporter interviewed Mrs. Fricker, who showed her appealing letters from slip disc sufferers living in neighboring districts. Then she met Fricker, whom she described as energetic and genial, who told her he had just been successfully treating a young actress. In answer to questions, he mentioned some of the patients who had flocked to him at previous healing sessions with slip discs, stomach ulcers, migraine, arthritis, asthma, bunions, tuberculosis, cancer, and indeed all the disease which afflict humanity. "I have no medical knowledge at all," said Fricker, as the reporter sat in the armchair to watch him at work. The first patient to enter the room was W.H. Payne of Barrett Avenue, Wood Green, a fireman who had come on his way to night duty. "I was injured in 1943, he said, and have been in pain ever since. I lay in hospital waiting for an operation and could not make up my mind to have it because they told me there was a 50-50 chance that I might not walk again." Fricker gave treatment while music was played on the radiogram. It was not sacred music, but popular tunes chosen, said Fricker, because he felt the vibration helped. I shall explain the reason in a later chapter. The reporter asked how he was able to perform these cures. "It is God working through me," he replied. "Doctors who have passed over are given great knowledge on the other side. I am clairaudient. These doctors speak to me and tell me what is wrong with the people who come to me, and they tell me what to do." The patients, he explained, had something akin to an operation and might expect a little soreness for a couple of days. The reporter described how Fricker held Payne's hands for a moment. This, said the healer, was a moment in which the spirit doctors told him what was wrong with the patient. Then the operation was performed, with Fricker concentrating on the area of pain. 2 minutes later, the patient was doing something that had been impossible since 1943, bending down and touching his toes. She noticed that after every treatment, Fricker insisted that the patient should go home and offer a prayer of thanks to God. The reporter watched treatment given to 5 other patients, all slip disc cases. There was a woman whose trouble began 2 years earlier and had spent 5 months in plaster. Soon she bent down and touched her toes. The next was a man who said he had tried heat therapy, shortwave treatment, exercise manipulations, and massage and obtained slight relief from pain, but no cure. Then came a postman who had spent 3 weeks on his back in a hospital and was now forced to wear a special belt. He was followed by another man who, after consulting a Harley Street specialist, had been put in plaster for 3 months. Finally, there was a neighbor still suffering with pains in the back. Each volunteered that speedy relief had been demonstrated. There followed this significant statement. Many of them went home with their steel-framed surgical belts tucked under their arms. Accompanying the reporter's account was a picture of Fricker treating Mrs. Emily Shore, aged 48, of Blake Road, New Southgate. She had been suffering from a slip disc for years. "The pain went as soon as Mr. Fricker touched me," she said. "I feel a new woman, and the family feels that it's got a new mum. I feel happier than if I had won a football pool. For years I had to rest for 2 hours every afternoon. I couldn't go out in the evening, and the pain was wearing on my nerves and making me irritable. When I left Mr. Fricker, I went to a dance and danced until midnight. This weekend I've done washing, scrubbing, and cooking. I couldn't be happier." These 2 newspaper stories were only the beginning. Accounts were to appear not only in local journals, in provincial newspapers, and in weekly magazines, national newspapers, but even in publications abroad. Fricker was truly launched on his healing crusade. End of chapter. Chapter 5. Once I Was Blind. The final irrefutable proof of spirit healing is that it shall perform cures in cases that are hopeless, either because medical skill, knowledge, and experience can do no more, or the patient suffers from one or more afflictions that are baffling because they cannot be diagnosed. The healer's contribution is to give healing, that is, to make himself the channel for the divine, vitalizing power that streams through him. It is not for him to choose which sufferer shall be cured. He has no such choice. Neither can he command the healing force to flow through him. He must be the cooperative agent, prepared to treat everyone who comes within his purview. Obviously, the natural law imposes a limit to healing, for at some time each one of us must die. Physical immortality is no part of the divine plan. There are other limitations. If a finger has been amputated, healing cannot replace his member. There is, however, no reason why anyone should die from disease before their allotted time or in agony. Fricker believes, rightly or wrongly, that every person is born with his death date stamped on him. This is akin to the fatalistic belief held by so many who served during the last World War, that if a bullet did not have their number on it, they would survive. If it did, then death was inevitable. In Fricker's view, God, destiny, providence, whatever name you like to call it, has ordained the length of our physical lives. What healing can do is to ensure that death, when it comes, should be natural, peaceful, and painless. Death, which after all is but a second birth into a larger life, should be accomplished when we are ready for it, just as the apple drops from the tree when it is ripe. When he is confronted with patients whose passing he clairvoyantly knows is imminent, Fricker naturally does not acquaint them with the fact, because the truth is that most people are not ready to be told. Neither does he refuse to continue to see patients, particularly old people, whom he has discharged as cured, simply because he knows that their visits fill him with confidence, making their day for them, and thus life becomes worth living. He never knows before he treats a patient how many visits will have to be made. The voice, he says, tells him when no further treatment is necessary. Spontaneous cures are rare, but they do happen. When they occur, no one is more delighted than Fricker to see the supreme demonstration of what spirit power can accomplish. It is no easy task to spend all of your working life in an atmosphere of disease and suffering when every person you see is afflicted by one of the many illnesses that bedevil mankind. Every patient believes that his or her complaint is the most important in the world, and it is as far as he or she is concerned. The healer has to be sympathetic, listen often to the long recital of symptoms, and never by an inflection indicate any impatience that he has heard it all before, or something very much like it. He must present a confident, radiant, dynamic, breezy, optimistic figure, filling everyone with hope as they approach him. In this role, Fricker is superb. I, who have known all the leading healers, have been intrigued by the differences in their methods. Obviously, the divine power, being infinite, is capable of an infinite number of manifestations. It would seem, however, that the Spirit cooperates or always improving their techniques, perhaps through experience, and adapting the power they transmit to obtain the best results with a minimum of expenditure. This is evidence of supernormal intelligence at work, as I will later show, indicates some of the contribution made by former medical men who still desire to utilize their knowledge in helping suffering humanity. With Fricker, the whole healing process has been, as far as I can see, accelerated. He is able, as a result, to give more personal treatments than he has hitherto been the case. If it is possible to use a term, it appears that the technique has been streamlined. Fricker's role is, therefore, the ability to demonstrate that the minimum treatment produces a marked improvement in the patient. Thus he is untroubled by skepticism, medical prejudice, hostility, or people who say they have no faith. I have all the faith that is necessary, he tells them. When his voice tells him that a cure has been effected, Fricker unhesitatingly tells the patient to resume normal living, to end the special diet that may have been imposed, to cast away spinal jackets and surgical belts, and to have an X-ray to prove that he is right. At this stage, I would like to introduce 5 cases of cures in which I speak from personal experience. In each of them, the healing provided proved that God provides a second chance. I met Maud Aldridge at Cambridge Road, Enfield, Middlesex, in Fricker's Sanctuary, where she told me that her cure, after she was virtually blind for over 35 years, was an answer to a prayer. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of joy, as she related her dramatic story. For most of her life she had lived in a world of darkness. A film practically covered both eyes. Her only vision was equivalent to a space occupied by the top of a pin. To see meant holding an object close to her eyeballs. She could do no housework. To thread a needle was almost impossible. She could not see anyone in the street, nor could she distinguish one object from another. She could not be left to go out at night. She is denied the cinema and television. Mrs. Aldridge prayed and prayed and prayed. Would God restore her sight to enable her to see son walk down the aisle when he married? Her prayer was answered. She had been the melancholy round of hospitals, doctors, and specialists. They could do nothing for her. Any attempt to induce vision caused great pain. During the war, when her husband was called up for military service, an army doctor came to see her. Because of her condition, he arranged for her husband to be transferred near home. A neighbor who had watched her suffering for a score of years, who had been cured by Fricker, told her to visit the healer. The suffering, I should mention, included periods of 8 to 10 weeks when her eyes had to be bandaged. Indeed, she was never free from pain. On May 15th, May 1956, a day etched in her memory, she was taken to Fricker by a kindly person in his car. From that first visit, there was an improvement. After the second visit, her life of pain ended. Within 6 weeks, she was beginning to see, and by Christmas she was cured. The film vanished. She paid her first visit to the cinema for 20 years. I am so happy, she cried as she told her story. I can see perfectly well. I watch television, see perfectly, though my husband has to wear glasses. I have had the joy of actually seeing my youngest boy grow up. I go out in the evening without fear. Have you told your doctor what has happened? I asked yes, she said, and he replied, God bless you, keep on with the treatment. I decided to put Mrs. Aldridge to the test. When her eyes were closed and her back turned, I threw a needle on the floor. Now find it, I said, merely indicating the direction where it lay. In a second she retrieved it and held it gleefully with tears again, filled bright eyes, glowing with life and vitality that could now see. I saw Mrs. Aldridge in January 1958 to bring her story up to date. I asked for her latest verdict. She replied that the new vision, 6 years after a cure, was still maintained. My eyes are very well, she said, and I am still able to go out on my own. The story of Lawrence Gresley, a cousin of Sir Winston Churchill, is in a way even more remarkable, because when Fricker first saw him, he thought this was a case not for healing but for surgery. His trouble was a malignant growth in the throat. I heard from Gresley the account of his cure when he expressed his gratitude in his Kensington flat 12 months after the healing had been accomplished. In November 1957, while attending a funeral in Staffordshire, he caught a chill which led to bronchial pneumonia. He was also riddled with tuberculosis, to use his own words. Just before Christmas 1957, he noticed a small hard lump on his neck. Medical experts, including his own doctor, a great personal friend, said the condition was serious. If it did not clear up within a week, an operation was imperative. Gresley, a blunt-spoken man, was not enamored of medical treatment. In 1947, he had spent 6 months in a sanitarium suffering from advanced tuberculosis. A world-famous specialist had given him the maximum of 18 months to live. As a result of absent healing, however, the specialist's verdict was proved wrong. Some very close friends who could speak from personal experience of Fricker's success advised him to consult a healer. At the first interview, Fricker thought this was a case for the surgeon's knife, but Gresley persuaded him to give healing. The growth became larger every day. Swallowing was increasingly difficult. Gresley, however, persevered with twice-weekly visits to Fricker, although for a time there was no indication that healing was at work. Indeed, the growth still became bigger. Soon it was the size of a plum. Finally, Fricker was able to give him the glad news. The voice announced that a cure would come. The growth will burst or disappear in the middle of the night, he told the patient. By the second week of February 1958, it was patent that the growth was smaller. At the end of March, exactly as foretold, it burst in the middle of the night. For a few days it discharged intermittently and then completely vanished. It was only then that Fricker revealed that the reason for his initial reluctance to give treatment, it looked as if that growth would have eventually strangled you, he said. When I saw Gresley in his home, he volunteered that the healing also cured his bronchial pneumonia and tuberculosis. In an almost Churchillian sentence, he summarized Fricker's labor. It is the finest pinnacle of human endeavor to alleviate suffering. As a matter of curiosity, I asked Gresley why he had not visited his doctor while receiving healing. He has also not been since. He replied, "I had burnt my boats. You can't have it both ways. You either follow the doctor's advice or the healer's. I choose Fricker, thank God." He added that since his cure, he had taken a great many people to Fricker who had been successful in every case. His powers are astounding, he said. On one of my many visits to Fricker's sanctuary, I met a patient who, with her fiancé, had sold all they possessed and borrowed some further money while in Canada to raise the fare to Britain. They clutched at the straw of hope which they thought Fricker might provide, for his fame had reached that dominion. Hers was a pathetic case which had bewildered the best medical opinion. I content myself by utilizing the account published in the Newcastle on Tyne Sydney Sun by journalist Brian Gibson, who was inquiring into spirit healing for his newspaper. In passing, I would like to mention that very early in my association with Fricker, I drew the attention of editors of national newspapers to his remarkable healing power, but they did nothing about it. I am, however, not unnaturally proud of the fact that I wrote the first story about him in a national magazine. Now, however, it has become a regular occurrence for accounts of his healing to be featured in national and provincial newspaper. Brian Gibson, writing in February 1960, called it the story of a miracle cure, which I shall never forget. The patient, Mariana Topher, aged 26, had come in absolute desperation with her 30-year-old fiancé, Thomas Baum. Gibson wrote, "Mariana is a dark, beautiful, and immensely vivacious girl, intelligent, well-educated, and very much in love with life. 7 weeks before I met her, she was on her deathbed. This was no exaggeration. It was the solemn assertion of her fiancé, who has traveled the world with her, spent a small fortune, not just to find a cure, but to find out what she is suffering from." Thomas Baum told him the first part of his story. While on a holiday in Mexico, Mariana first complained of feeling listless and drowsy. As it seemed to be nothing serious, they shrugged it off. But she did not improve. Instead, she became steadily worse. Back home in Canada, they consulted the family doctor. He was baffled. They saw a specialist. He, too, could find nothing the matter with her. They went from one doctor to another. Mariana was constantly in and out of hospital. Her condition steadily worsened. For 18 months, this tragic trek continued. Between them, Mariana and Thomas spent about £1,500 in their futile quest. Then a friend told me that he had been cured of cancer by a healer in London, said Thomas. He was sure the same thing could be done for Mariana. By this time she was helpless, almost oblivious of her surrounding. Thomas Bound made the arrangement for a flight to England, said the journalist borrowed £250 from their savings had already run out, and gambled everything on this last desperate chance. When they finally arrived at Fricker's home, Mariana was next door to death, said Gibson. She was now completely paralyzed, unable to walk, clothe herself, or feed herself, and she was in constant pain. She did not believe Fricker when he said she would be cured. I have never had any faith in healers, she told a reporter. I thought I was going to die. The next few days did nothing to relieve that fear. I had been in pain all the time, Mariana reported to Gibson, but after seeing Fricker, the pain became unbearable. I was very frightened. Gradually, however, the pain began to ease. 3 weeks later, she was on her feet, perfectly healthy again. Gibson asked Fricker what it was that had brought about Marianne so near to death. She had a tumor inside her liver, he said. If it had been discovered, it would have been absolutely inoperable. Since her return to Montreal, she has sent the healer her photograph, which she autographed, to dear Mr. Fricker in deepest gratitude. I interviewed Enrique Arias, an internationally known concert pianist, in his Kensington home in February 1959. A few days before, he had performed with the London Philharmonic Orchestra at the Royal Festival Hall. The thousands who watched him did not know that there would have been no performance had it not been for Fricker's healing. Arias was a living skeleton for whom the doctors in every country he visited could do no more. He was the victim of a mysterious chronic liver illness. Before he visited Fricker, completely skeptical about spiritual healing, he was desperate. His professional career was in jeopardy. He was a nervous wreck and life had become impossible. His black despair had come after 10 years' appearances as an international concert pianist because hospitals and doctors weren't able to cure his bilious attacks, which lasted for 5 or 6 days. It seemed as if he was doomed to be a permanent invalid just when he was mounting the upper rungs of his professional ladder. A South American by birth, Arias had been ill ever since he could remember. After consulting doctors in the United States, Canada, South Africa, France, Britain, and indeed every country he visited in connection with his career, and having exhaustive examinations in hospital, the cause of his trouble was finally diagnosed. There was a serious deficiency of acid in his digestive tract. They operated and removed his gallbladder because he was told it was not functioning properly. That produced an improvement for a time. But 2 years later, all his distressing symptoms returned, so did the bilious attacks. Arias went back to his doctors, but they could do no more to help him. After all, they said, the liver could not be removed. Take precautions was all they could suggest. Arias did and lived like an invalid. He followed a prescribed rigid diet, had as much fresh air as he could get, and avoided exertion. Alas, any spell of piano practice, indispensable to a concert artist, provoked a bilious attack. The heartbreaking decision had to be made: cancel some concerts. In the summer of 1958, he was very ill. He began to lose so much weight, he was below 9 stone. Then he thought he had cancer. Still warily consulting doctors, he found one who prescribed a course of pills which produced temporary improvements. But Arias continued to lose weight. None of his clothes fitted him any more. He began to look like a skeleton. The climax came in the autumn of that year when he was playing in Sweden. He was so ill that he could barely manage his performance. Arias returned to England a desperate man. This was a crisis. He was scheduled to appear at a large number of concerts, but he had reached the end of his tether. He was a sick man for whom all the greatest medical skill could do nothing. Destiny now took a hand. On a Saturday night in October 1958, he went to a concert at a Royal Festival Hall. He found the excited attendants talking about the remarkable results obtained that afternoon at a healings demonstration by Harry Edwards. What they said impressed me, said Arias, but it did not register. I was very skeptical about the subject and thought it was all done by suggestion. At this stage, his wife comes into the unfolding drama. Though not a spiritualist, she had always been interested in psychic matters. She had become very friendly with Nora Blackwood after this medium had been able to help her. Mrs. Blackwood suggested that Arias should visit Fricker. Still dubious, but with the attitude that it did no good, at least it could do no harm, Arias asked the healer for an appointment. When he arrived at 10:30 a.m., the time given, he was surprised to find there was a queue. He began to grumble to himself when he realized that it would be at least an hour before the healer could see him. When the turn came, his irritability was at its maximum. from the radiogram which Fricker sometimes uses because the vibrations of some records help the healing. I deal with this matter elsewhere in this book. There came the strains of a popular Italian song which had driven Arias frantic on the Riviera not long previously. If faith were required to get healing results, none was forthcoming from the skeptical, discontented musician. The treatment lasted a few minutes. Fricker asked some questions. Then he laid his hands on the pianist. "You will be all right," he said. "Drink some water after meals. Come and see me next week." What was the result? That night, said Arias, I felt awful. He knew another bilious attack was coming, but this one was different. It was like being seasick on board ship. He could hardly stand and had to lie down. To practice the piano was out of the question. The next morning, however, he felt quite all right, and from that day there had been only occasional and slightly bilious symptoms. All told, he went to see Fricker a dozen times. He knew the healing was efficacious because he noticed his clothes did not fit anymore. At first he thought they were shrinking. Then he realized he was putting on weight. Soon he had to order new clothes, shirts, and collars. Arias no longer thought in terms of canceling concerts. Spirit healing had enabled him to resume his interrupted career. End of chapter. Chapter 6. A Dilemma for a Specialist. My fifth account, which almost deserves a chapter to itself because of its remarkable sequel, concerns a man who is now one of my great personal friends. He is M.H. Tester of Haywards Heath, Sussex. I regard his the cast-iron case of spiritual healing, for it was confirmed by one of the leading orthopedic physicians in Britain. Medical etiquette forbids the publication of his name. He examined his patient before and after healing, frankly expressed his amazement at the result, and volunteered that the operation he had regarded as essential was no longer required. Tester's story is really remarkable, for a providential telephone call when all seemed desperate led to his being healed. He is an excellent witness because, as a chartered surveyor, he is a professional man whom nobody could accuse of being credulous or hysterical. Since the war, he has built a lucrative practice in which his careful judgment is an important factor. He is shrewd, knowledgeable, and well-read, particularly in his study of world religions. Here is a story he told me in January 1960 when I interviewed him in his office in London's West End. His trouble began at Easter 1958 with a slipped disc. This was confirmed by 2 sets of x-rays. Until August 1959, he wore 2 different types of orthopedic jackets. Treatment by heat and osteopathy brought moderate relief. August was the crucial month. He was on holiday in France when the disc went out so badly that he could not walk, sit, stand, or sleep. The pain was excruciating. So serious was his condition that he was flown back to become a hospital patient. An ambulance awaited his arrival at the airport, and he was taken straight to hospital. There he remained for a month. For 3 weeks he was subject to pelvic traction. This consists of lying on a board while strapped to a harness, with the foot of the bed jacked up, so as to enable a pulley to open the vertebrae and remove pressure on the sciatic nerve. It was done to relieve the painful sciatica in his right leg. He was in a bad way, for his body was bent sideways and forwards in a strange locked position. With drugs and tranquilizers, the pelvic traction eased his pain, but it did not cure the slipped disc or correct his bent posture. Because he suffers from a skin complaint, he could not be fitted with the usual plaster jacket. Instead, one had to be made of a plastic material which could be removed to enable the skin to be treated. This he was told he must wear for 3 months. Then the jacket could be reduced in size for another 3 months. After that he should be able, so they said, to wear a simple form of spinal belt. There was a period of convalescence. In mid-October 1959, he decided to resume his professional work in the West End office. He found it, however, impossible to carry on. The jacket was uncomfortable. At home, he had to sleep with a board under the mattress. Because of the pain, he was compelled to take heavy doses of sleeping pills. He could not drive a car. Soon he was reduced to coming to his office 2 or 3 days a week, and only then for 2 or 3 hours. There was a growing numbness in his right foot and a loss of sensation on top of that. Every time he moved, it brought pain to his leg. Medically, he was under the care of his local doctor, and there was the orthopedic surgeon at the hospital available in an emergency. Tester, rightly feeling that his condition was worsening, told the doctor that he wanted an appointment with the leading orthopedic physician in the country. There is no doubt about this being an expert in slipped discs. He has written a highly praised book on this painful affliction. The appointment was made for the 21st of October. The specialist had the original X-ray plates and Tester's complete clinical history. There was a thorough examination. The verdict was a slipped disc, with the experts saying that the dislocation is one of the worst he had seen. He thought that Tester might get some relief from the orthopedic jacket, but no more than that. He advised an immediate operation. This, he said, could be 90% successful, but there was a faint risk of paralysis. Tester did not relish the idea of an operation, especially with its element of risk. He had a wife, 5 children, and his professional life to consider. He told the physician that he would like to leave the decision till after Christmas. The answer was that to delay longer would be dangerous. Tester went from the consultation to his office, completely fed up, to use his own words. About 15 minutes later, the telephone rang. It was a business friend to ask about a comparatively unimportant matter. They had not spoken to one another for 2 or 3 months. When the business item was finished, the friend said, "You sound depressed." Tester told him the reason. "If I send you to somebody who could help you, will you go without asking silly questions?" "Yes," said Tester, who was ready to clutch at any straw. The telephone caller, a spiritualist and an old friend of Fricker, made an appointment for Tester to see him, as a matter of emergency, at 5 p.m. that day. Tester was not told that Fricker was a healer, but merely given his name and address. Wearing his polyethylene jacket and carrying the stick, which was now essential for support, he arranged to be taken by car to Fricker's house. "I went because I was desperate," he said. "I was ready to try anything." He had never before encountered spiritual healing, and did not even know that healers existed. "Are you a faith healer?" he asked Fricker. "Not exactly," was the reply. "Do I need to have faith in you?" "Well, I don't care whether you have faith or not. I have all the faith that is necessary." Fricker gave him one treatment. This consisted, as usual, of rubbing his hands for a few moments up and down the spine over the plastic jacket. Then he asked him to remove the jacket. Again came the rubbing, this time over the back and protruding hip, which by now was very much out of alignment. Fricker's next suggestion surprised Tester, who only that morning had heard the specialist's serious words. He told the patient to make a parcel of the plastic jacket and to take it home under his arm with a stick. Further, he was to remove the board from his bed and sleep on a mattress. Because Tester could not use public transport, he hired a car to take him from Fricker's home to Victoria Station, where there was a long wait before his 45-minute train journey to Hayworth Heath. There a car drove him home. From the moment he left Fricker's, about 10 minutes after he had arrived, Tester felt a great deal of relief. It was the first time he had discarded his plastic jacket. He has never worn it since or used a stick. He paid 6 visits once weekly to Fricker. Each time the treatment was similar, the rubbing of the back and the legs. There was never any manipulation or pressure exerted on the body. After the 3rd visit on a Friday, Tester had what seemed to be a relapse. His condition flared up and he was too ill to go to the office on Monday. The next day his wife drove him to Fricker. After that treatment, he says, improvement was regular and recognizable. It was obvious to him after the 6th visit that to all intents and purposes he was cured. There was no more pain. His body was straight, with the hip merely protruding slightly. The sole symptom was an odd occasional twinge. By early November he had fully resumed his normal professional life. His doctor was surprised and delighted with the obvious improvement. When he asked Tester what had happened and heard the answer, he declared himself amazed, but added that this was something beyond his experience. It was all very well for Tester to feel that he had come to the end of his slip disc trouble, but he wanted medical confirmation. He asked his doctor to arrange for him to see the same specialist he had consulted. On the 22nd of January, almost 3 months to the day since his first consultation, he presented himself to the slip disc medical expert. "You wanted to see me after Christmas," said Tester. "Here I am. Please examine me." The specialist gave him a thoroughly detailed half-hour examination, paying particular attention to the leg muscles and reflexes. Each time that he pressed a nerve to remove a joint, he asked if there was any pain. No was the answer. The specialist became more and more surprised as his examination proceeded. "Obviously something has been done to you. What is it?" Tester replied that he would prefer to have his diagnosis before telling him. "Well, you are 3/4 cured," was the verdict. "You have all the symptoms of a man successfully cured of a slipped disc. Within 4 to 6 weeks I would expect the remaining symptoms to clear up. There is a slight weakness in muscles that have not been used. There might," he added, "be an odd twinge during the next 6 months." As far as he was concerned, however, no further action or treatment, let alone an operation, was necessary. Moreover, he later wrote and confirmed all these statements to Tester's doctor. Tester told him about the healing by Fricker. The result? The specialist was amazed. Even this is not the end of the story, for Tester was determined to be certain, as far as humanly possible, that there could be no loophole for skeptics. He said to the specialist, "Will you please answer 2 questions that are important to me? Is there any chance that what was wrong with me could have been corrected itself on its own?" The answer was definite. None at all. Is there any possibility that what was wrong with me was psychosomatic? Tester wanted to be sure that no one could accuse him of having an ailment for which his mind was responsible. No, out of the question was the answer. The sequel to Tester's healing is equally as remarkable. In September 1960, he was consulted professionally by a leading South African lawyer who, for some reason, must remain anonymous. The lawyer had also come to Britain to visit the same specialist whom Tester had seen. Because of 2 displaced vertebrae, he was compelled to wear for 4.5 years an orthopedic jacket from the time he got out of bed in the morning until he retired at night. Even so, he could hardly walk. He could not drive a car or bend down. The specialist had told him there was no cure. All he could suggest was that the patient needed a different sort of jacket and perhaps some injection to make the pain tolerable. Tester's meeting with the lawyer seemed providential, for it happened soon after his visitor had been to the specialist. Just as his friend had intervened at the crucial moment, so Tester now became the instrument of Providence. He showed the lawyer the account of his cure, which I had written in 2 words. The visitor, a shrewd man of the world, read it. When Tester asked if he'd like a treatment from Fricker, he jumped at the opportunity. Fortunately, the healer was available, and Tester drove the visitor to see him right away. Fricker diagnosed the trouble without being told and astounded the lawyer by asking him to remove the orthopedic jacket. 10 minutes later, the healer announced to the surprised patient, "You are all right." The lawyer looked at him in amazement. "What can't you do?" asked Fricker. "Touch my toes," was the reply. The visitor did so. "What else can't you do?" asked Fricker, when the reply was that he could not lie down. The healer got the patient to recline on the floor and roll himself over. "I can't do my shoelaces up," were his next words. "Yes, you can," said Fricker, who undid his shoelaces. The lawyer tied them up again. A few days later, the visitor was living a normal life. He had discarded his orthopedic jacket, which had plagued him for 4.5 years. Daily, before he returned to South Africa, he telephoned Tester to express his gratitude. "I did a 5-mile walk," he said, "and on this last telephone call, my wife was fatigued, but I was not." Back home, associates and friends were delighted to see his rejuvenated figure, and he has sent other incurable patients to Fricker, and each has been cured. One day, Tester was told by Fricker that he too possessed the latent healing gift. Astonished at the news, he experimented on members of the family and was delighted with the result. Somehow or other, the news of his healing spread, as it always did. Soon, Tester was being asked to treat friends and colleagues. Nowadays, he says laughingly that when appointments are made for clients to see him, he does not know whether they require his professional services or will ask for healing. When the wheel turns full circle and the cured patient heals, this is indeed a revelation of divine power at work. As I complete this chapter, I read another tribute to Fricker, this time from Evadine Price, who has achieved fame in many fields. As a television personality actress, dramatist, novelist, and journalist. Her account, published in the May 1962 issue of the magazine Prediction, begins with her description of how nearly 2 years earlier she was attacked by a mysterious illness which has never yet been diagnosed. "Overnight, practically all of my reactions slowed down," she writes. "My head whizzed round and round. I couldn't go anywhere alone in case I fell down. I had to sit up all night, propped with pillows, for if I lay flat I passed out. My speech was slow and my limbs weighed a ton. I completely baffled the medical profession by not being in pain. I thought I had it, and I was dying. I was utterly depleted, and nothing did me any good." After about 12 weeks of misery, a friend suggested that her husband should contact Fricker, and an appointment was fixed. The healer told her later that when first he laid hands on her, he thought, "Poor little Evadine, I can do nothing, she's nearly over." 5 healings later, however, his eyes glazed over, and he seemed to be listening to unseen voices. Then he nodded and said, "You are all right, Evadine. They tell me I can cure you now. They don't want you on the other side yet. You've got work to do." This bulletin from the next world should have boosted her morale. Evadine Price comments, but she had no moral left to boost. She seemed to grow worse every day. She was told this often happens, which also did not help her. By January 1961, she had been Fricker's patient 9 weeks, and there was no improvement. But rather dramatically, the 12th week saw her completely healed. "I was crazily happy," she writes. "For over 6 months, I'd existed in a nebulous hell, and suddenly I was a human again. This ecstatic state lasted exactly a fortnight, when I had developed a terrible rash from neck to toe. I, who had never had a spot on my body in my life, back I dashed to the healer, hysterical and terrified. He was unmoved, saying, "It is the final kick of your illness. You're lucky. The poison's coming out of you." "You must cure it," she pleaded. "No, let nature take its course, Evadine." "What if it comes on my face?" she demanded. "I'm on television." He listened again to his unseen voice. "They tell me it won't come on your face," was his calm reply. It never did. At the time, however, she refused to believe him. She stormed out, furious at his refusal to treat her rash. She tried orthodox method. Her doctor sent to her skin hospital, where they gave pills and ointments, none of which did any good whatsoever. Finally, being due in Plymouth for a television season, she was forced to follow the healer's advice. Let nature take its course. The rash faded away during the next 6 months, but before that her conscience troubled her, and she wrote apologizing to Fricker for behaving like a temperamental star. His reply gave more advice. "Tell me you must slow up for a year at least." "My trouble is, I have built-in conviction that I know it all," she tells her readers. "I did not slow up, and after a summer of the nerve-wracking television, back came the mystery illness. I was too ill to make the long journey from Devon, so in response to my frantic appeal, I was put on the Fricker absent healing list, and very, very slowly I came back to health again. This time I did stop work, and now in February 1962, I am living a normal life." After saying that the history of this fantastic man's fantastic healings would fill several issues of prediction, Evadine adds that how he does it in his surrounding defeats me, as does his method. Anyone who expected VIP treatment was due for some nasty shock. "I just could not believe it when I arrived the first day," she writes. "A long queue stretched right down the dreary little street. Could they all be patients waiting to see the healer? Right first time they were, and every one of them would be seen before me, even though I had an appointment. The rigid rule was first come, first serve, and who you were did not matter. Celebrity or office cleaner to Fricker, you were just another sick person." She sat in the car while her husband queued for her, and a couple of hours later her turn came. By then she was so physically and mentally exhausted that she decided never to go through this ordeal again. But for her husband, desperate by now, she would never have returned. It was because of him she persevered and made the shocking journey 1, 2, or 3 times a week whenever Fricker wanted her. "I used to sit like a zombie on a hard chair in the waiting room, mentally isolated from the other patients who chatted amiably to each other," she said. "One day my glazed eyes saw miracle healing. A man in agony with a slip disc came out of the healing room almost skipping, but it never occurred to me I might have a miracle healing of my own." Evadine Price is frank about her reaction. She never felt uplifted, merely jangled and rattled. The spiritual healing she had previously experienced had been in an atmosphere of calm, quiet, and peace. But the blaring Elvis Presley record hit me like a blow. I never protested. I was too far gone. I just submitted and let Fricker get on with it. But to my amazement, on the 12th week, this method worked. Don't ask me why or how. I wouldn't know. I only know this, that Fricker healed me. She describes Fricker as a stocky, poker-faced man who radiates vitality and confidence. But looking back on those early days when I was undoubtedly very near death, his face was very kind and gentle and sweet. He understood my aloof detachment for what he was trying to do for me. I see that now. Sometimes, when she received treatment, Fricker vibrated like an Indian fakir. On other occasions, he just laid his hands on her. She insists that her cure was not due to faith healing, for I had no faith in his power to get me back into circulation. He did it without any help from me at all. End of chapter. Chapter 7 answers to challenging questions. How does Fricker cope with the thousands of letters pleading for help that constitute a never-ending cascade? They arrive at the rate of 200 to 300 a day. Their numbers accelerated whenever his healing is featured in any national newspaper or widely circulated magazine. Then it is not unusual for the postbag to be swelled by a further 2,000 letters. Why do they write? Having read the account of his success in a case deemed a miracle, a word that frequently recurs because the patient was incurable. These sufferers clutch at the straw, hoping that they might be restored to health. Unless you have been associated with an outstanding healer like Fricker, you have no idea of the many thousands of despairing people whose lives are filled with agony after they have been told that medicine can do no more for them. Because that he believes he is a recipient of a divine power, and that he was born to fulfill a mission of mercy specifically directed towards these derelicts of humanity, Fricker arranges to see these he regards as emergency cases. Every letter is acknowledged and a card is made for record purposes. Dealing with the mail is a huge task, for it involves utilizing 2 secretaries, one of whom works part-time, and 4 helpers who type letters in their home. The emergency cases he regards as those on whom the death sentence has been pronounced by doctors. They have been told that they only have a few years or months or weeks to live. Provided they are not bedridden, they can arrange to get to a sanctuary. They are given very early appointments. He also gives speedy appointments to patients suffering from slipped discs, stomach ulcers, migraines, and angina. He knows from past experience that these are afflictions which, if there are no other complicating factors, can be cured in 2 or 3 visits. To the uninitiated who have not seen Fricker at work and the results, this claim may sound bombastic. The essence of his healing is simplicity. That is, he says, is what God wants him to do, and he does it. He explained to me the reason for the speedy cures of these ailments. It is a demonstration of how rapidly divine power can work, and constitutes a challenge to those doctors to make them realize the real source of all healing. Fricker regards sufferers from colitis, arthritis, and rheumatism as non-urgent, so far as his healing power is concerned, because of the time factor involved in their healing. Experience has shown that usually their bones are so twisted or malformed after prolonged medical treatment that, in his own words, they have to be straightened out before healing can truly operate. These sufferers are invited to cooperate in absent healing as a preliminary to be given an appointment. They are told to tune in to him at 9 p.m. nightly, visualizing his features, and to report once a week. According to Fricker, this is how the absent healing works. He is a divine powerhouse. By tuning into him, as he were a radio or television set, the patient makes a link to that which is psychic or spiritual equivalent to a wavelength, along with the power travels. Does it work? Well, by a curious coincidence, on the morning when I dictated these words, there appeared a letter in the Daily Sketch from a reader who described how Fricker had cured him by removing hundreds of teeny blisters from his hands. The doctor said this was an allergy, and that although conditions like these could arrive overnight, they might take weeks to cure. For 2 days the patient took the doctor's tablets and applied the ointment. Because there was no improvement, he again saw the doctor, who advised consulting a specialist. It could go on for weeks unless we stop it now, was the verdict. Instead of visiting a specialist, the patient telephoned Fricker, who said, "I will give you an absent healing." The next morning it was obvious that the allergy had been checked, and the following day the improvement was so marked that he went to see Fricker, who, after laying his hands on him, said, "You will be well by Saturday." As this was a Wednesday, the patient thought the forecast was impossible. By the Saturday, however, the cure was complete, that the reader and his wife were able to keep a party date. I like the way he ends his letter. Will doctors scoff and say, psychology? If it was, let's have more psychology or more Edward Frickers. Appointments are made in batches for every quarter of an hour, and nobody is seen without one. Again, I appreciate that these unfamiliar with Fricker's healings will regard this as fantastic. But long ago I called him Fricker the Fantastic. The speed of the healing is truly astonishing. Sometimes only a few seconds are necessary for a treatment. The normal time is 2 minutes, and the exceptional is 5. Fricker works 5 full days a week. On Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Friday, he starts healing at 10 a.m. The last batch of appointment is scheduled for 5 p.m. when the outer door is closed. Every patient is seen, with the result that frequently it is nearly 7 p.m. before he leaves. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, he works only during the morning. His records show that he personally treats between 800 and 1,000 sufferers every week. To confirm these figures, when I interviewed him, he checked the previous Saturday morning's patients. They numbered 152. Moreover, on one day he told me that he had treated as many as 242 sufferers. Never before in the history of healing had so many personal treatments in so short a time been given by one man. In the course of an intimate association with all the outstanding healers during the past 40 years, I have watched the different techniques that have been employed. Obviously, all healing, whoever its human channel may be, is part of a plan which reveals itself in some of its aspects. In Fricker's case, so it seems to me, by accelerating the power of the plan demonstrates that healing can accommodate itself to the streamlined jet age in which we live. Fricker was chosen for this task. Do not ask me how or when the choice was made, for we do not know, because he is by nature a quick, lively individual, accustomed to getting things done in a speedy fashion. One of the marked supernormal aspects of his healing is that at the end of the day, he is not even tired despite the physical labor involved. Neither do his arms ache. Most of the time he is working, in the sense that he is utilizing energy, either standing or seated. He not only lays his hands on patients, but in every case performs a curious kind of rubbing action. It has no resemblance to manipulation as done by osteopath or bone setters, a form of treatment of which he knows nothing. The rubbing is gentle, not violent, and applied to that part of the body where the cause resides as distinct from the effect. This rubbing, he has found, increases the flow of power through him. It is reminiscent of a way of the automatic action we perform in rubbing any part of the body which happens to pain us. When we do it, it has a soothing effect, and it may be a natural self-recuperative process. The healing power, Fricker says, flows through his right hand. He experiences a sensation akin to placing an electric plug in a socket and switching it on. If his right hand is applied to the spine, then his left hand must be placed on the chest in a direct line with it, which completes the circuit. Perhaps it is somehow like electricity, he says, and there must be a positive and a negative, but I don't really know. This, of course, is the truth. None of us really know simply because we are dealing with imponderables and intangibles that belong to the realm of the spiritual. While he is healing, this tremendous force flows through him. Then it ceases, and he has to remove his hands, which produces the feeling as if an electric plug has been pulled from a socket. In his early days, he used to think that if he kept his hands a little longer in the patient, more power would come through and the result would be quicker. He knows differently now. It has its own time limit, devised by superior, though invisible intelligence, who know exactly what they're doing. It is reasonable to believe that this power either is a life force itself or its equivalent, for its application to the patient drives out disease and produces that balance between mind, body, and spirit, which is the only true health. So how does he know where to apply the healing power? As each patient comes into the sanctuary for treatment, the voice explains exactly what is wrong. Have you had to consult medical dictionaries to find out the meaning of these complaints? I asked him. No, he replied, dictionaries are only the contents of other people's minds. I get my information from a higher source. Here I thought I would make a determined attempt to solve this mystery of the voice. Is it the same voice that you heard since you were a child? I inquired. Yes, he answered, adding at the shattering statement, I believe it is the voice of God. When I asked Fricker to explain some of the theological implications involved in his statement, he would have none of them. The feature of his healing and his outlook, I reiterate, is a simplicity that highbrows might regard as naive. But it is in harmony with the statement of the great healer of Nazareth, except ye become as little children. Fricker's thinking is uncomplicated in this respect by theological or creedal consideration. I asked if he really believed that this voice came from the God who made the whole universe and everything that it contains. If so, how did the infinite Creator become an individual who spoke with a male voice? Did he believe in a personal God? His answer was direct. No, God is a spirit, but assumes personal form to reach his material world. Did he then believe that he was the only healing instrument for God? No, he answered, thousands of people have this healing power, but they do nothing about it. I tried another approach. Has this voice ever been proved wrong in what it said to you? Was my next question. Well, not to me, he answered. Next I put the controversial question. Can you cure everybody? The reply was quick and direct. No, people come to me and I know that they are going to die, but the healing helps their spiritual life. Still pressing him to explain what lies behind the healing, I asked, what in your view determines whether a person should be cured? I report that the answer again was refreshingly simple. The voice tells me the first time I see a patient if there will be a cure. Sometimes I am told how many treatments will be required, but this is not always revealed. I am, however, always told when there is going to be an instantaneous healing. Here I introduce an aspect that has always intrigued me regarding Fricker as distant from other spirit healers. He has never sat in a circle of friends or relatives meeting regularly, as is customary to develop his gift. He does not make a habit of withdrawing into the silence at stated periods to meditate or to attempt closer attunement with the Spirit inspires. I asked him to explain his outlook. You may have guessed the answer. Apart from the healing, he said, the voice insists that I live a normal life, just like other people in this material world. They have to understand that I am a human being like they are. The only difference is that I have this divine gift. Back I return to the question as to why some are cured and others are not. Well, this is how Fricker sees it. Everyone who comes into this world is born to do a job, whether the individual lives for a few weeks, months, or years. When the job is done, they go home, that is, they die. His belief is a fatalistic one, in the sense that, according to his view, everyone's death is fixed when they are born. He said, God knows exactly what he is doing. Healers are here to help people, even when they only have a few more years to live, and doctors can do more than to alleviate their pain. Thus, in his philosophy, the healer's function is not to supplant the doctor, but to cooperate. Fricker is convinced that the hospitals of the future will have a healing department. When the skill of the doctor is exhausted, the medicine has reached its limit. Rather than send the patient home to die, he will be transferred to the healing department. Do you regard any disease as incurable? Was my next question. No, he answered. If God wants to cure, he can do so. According to Fricker, a cure is achieved with 90% of his patients. The remaining 10% have to die, for the disease has obtained too great a hold to yield to treatment. In making this statement, he pointed out that patients do not come to see him when they had only simple ailments. The overwhelming majority of those he treated were medical rejects, of whom 75% had received a death sentence. These, you must agree, are remarkable figures, but he insists they are proven by his results. Do you regard yourself as a medium? Was my next question. Well, of course I am, I answered. I am a go-between for spirit and matter. End of chapter. Chapter 8. Problems Facing a Healer. How does a healer deal with the problem of maintaining himself and his family while he devotes the whole of his life to treating sufferers? There is a small minority with a view, nonsensical in my opinion, that because healing is a divine gift, its possessor should make no charge. Curiously enough, this minority, always so vocal, does not have a similar attitude towards other possessors of divine gifts, composers, sculptors, painters, singers, and writers. Neither is any suggestion made as to how these gifted individuals should pay their rent, buy clothes and food, and the other necessities of life. A very few healers make a fixed charge for their services, just as professional men and women do, but this practice is open to criticism on the ground that it might deprive the poorest of their service. Some religious individuals point to the New Testament and say there is no record of Jesus making a charge for performing his healing. This may or not be true. If he did not, then obviously he must have been maintained by the charity of friends and supporters. Obviously, this is a question every healer must settle for himself according to his own conscience. I asked Fricker for his opinion. He recalled that when he began his healing mission, he devoted 3 mornings a week to it for 2 years and never made any kind of charge. Indeed, there was not even a plate in which patients might place voluntary contributions. It is a striking commentary that during this period not one patient even offered to make a donation. Fricker was satisfied to continue in this fashion, seeing to it that he was still deriving income at his factory. Then came the crucial decision to devote his whole time to healing. I realized I had to live and keep my wife and family, he said. I did not want to charge a fee because I knew this was a divine gift that would have turned it into a commercial proposition. And it would have resulted in my gift being available only to people who had means, and would shut out the poor who were the most deserving cases and are equally God's children. If a fee were stipulated, it would have to be the same figure for everyone, because it would be impossible to have a system of graded payments with a questionnaire seeking information about the patient's income. This could never be a part of a healer's function. Fricker told of an experiment he made. A month before he disposed of his factory, he put a collecting plate in the healing room, just to see what would happen. After a few days, he found that sufficient donations were made by patients which would satisfy his modest requirements. At this time, the voice was still urging him to relinquish his business and assuring him that he would be able to provide for his family. He made the great decision to sell his factory, knowing that the money from its sale would help if he struck a bad patch financially. From the day he placed the plate for free will offerings, he made a practice of telling every new patient, "If you cannot afford to give a donation, please forget it. If you can, then give what you can afford." It is refreshing to report Fricker's experience that he has found that even those who obviously are striving to live on the smallest budgets are anxious to contribute, but he refuses to allow them to part with any money. There are at least 150 cases a week, he said, when I tell patients that under no circumstance must they place any money in the plate. How does he know which patients come within this category? Frequently the voice tells him, and sometimes adds, that these are cases which should be helped. Then when the healing is over, and I have seen him do this many times, he goes to the plate, takes some money out of it, and gives it to the patient, with a suggestion that will help to pay their fares or buy some necessities. Fricker also indulges in a charming practice. He has a great love for children, who constitute a large proportion of his patients. He buys chocolates and always presents some to every child who visits him, even keeping special sweets for those who do not like chocolate. He has adopted in the past 3 years a local girls' orphanage with its 16 inmates. Each is provided with presents and cakes on birthday, with pocket money throughout the year, with Easter eggs and a special Christmas party. The matron always notifies him of whatsoever she requires for her charges, and Fricker ensures her that her requests are fulfilled. He is delighted at the fact that there are so many patients have voluntarily associated themselves with his Christmas party. Fricker is rightfully proud of the fact that in the 8 years that he is devoted to his healing, he has never asked any sufferer for a fee. Moreover, there is no difference in the treatment given to patients, irrespective of their financial status. In any case, he does not know what their contributions will be until after the treatment has been given. My concern is with the healing treatment, he said, and not with the money that is paid. God does not impose a means test. He only wants me to heal his children. What have you learned as a result of the healing? I asked. It is still like a dream to me, he answered. I cannot believe that it is through me that these cures are performed. I am amazed to find the number of complaints which are regarded as incurable by doctors. I never thought that this was possible. I am beginning to wonder what doctors can cure simply because of the number of incurable cases that come to me. When I was younger, it seemed that when people were ill, they went to their medical man and they got better. But now, alas, there seem to be thousands of sufferers whom they simply cannot help. I must say this is a mystery to me, especially as we have in this country a national health service. My next question was, has the healing had any effect on your religious outlook? Fricker replied very simply, to me, religion means to help your neighbor. I reminded him of a comment made a few days earlier by a clergyman who had said that if healing was done in front of an altar, miracles were more likely to happen. I don't see why they should, answered Fricker. God does not intend his children to be separated, as they are at present all over the world by different religions. God intends them to be members of one happy family. The trouble with healing in any religious surrounding is that it is limited to the members of the denomination. People of all religions and of none come to me, and there are no theological complications. I welcome them all simply because each one is God's child. This outlook is reflected in the fact that Fricker has received objects of veneration which he exhibits in his sanctuary, and that have been presented by patients of varying denominations. Would you regard yourself as a religious man? I inquired. Again, the answer was simple. In the eyes of God, yes, but not according to many clergymen. But I am serving God by helping his children. Do you feel any necessity to go to church? I asked. Why should I? He answered, seeing that I am working for God and expressing his power every day of my life. Fricker told me of one of the many clergymen who visited his sanctuary. The minister said, your healing, despite what you think, is the work of the devil. Fricker asked him, can you heal the sick? No, was the answer. Then you must be working for the wrong man, Fricker told him. If the devil is performing these miracles of healing, he is doing a divine work. Not all clergymen are so intolerant. One local vicar has made Fricker's healing the subject of flattering comments in his parish magazine, saying that it is in line with that performed by the founder of their religion and something that all clergy should automatically be doing. Naturally, Fricker's success are known to many local doctors, some of whom send their patients. I cannot name these medical practitioners. If I did, they would be in danger of being struck off the medical register for daring to associate with an unorthodox healer. Does any other member of your family possess the healing gift? I asked. I recall that his wife, Grace, for 5 years regularly helped at his healing sessions, but did not do so now. Fricker is convinced that she possesses the gift and told this illuminating story. Not long ago, because of a tragedy involving a member of his family, Fricker had to make an urgent aeroplane flight to the continent and be absent for 3 days. There was no time to notify patients who had appointments that he would be unable to treat them. Undaunted, Grace went to the sanctuary to deal with the waiting patients, a formidable task, for naturally many of them were disappointed at not seeing her husband. A few decided to come back when Fricker had returned. The majority willingly submitted themselves to Grace's ministrations. Some of the results were pleasing and surprising. In one case, a deaf man whom Fricker had treated for 3 months had his hearing restored instantaneously. Grace was also delighted when 2 patients who suffered from slipped discs and had to be helped into the sanctuary by their wives were also spontaneously cured. She had also to deal with an emergency, a young child who had not eaten for 2 or 3 days because he was subject to constant vomiting, for which doctors could do nothing. After one treatment from Grace, the vomiting ceased, and immediately the child left with its parents. There was a demand to buy some food because he was hungry. Grace still continues to utilize her healing gift by visiting patients who are bedridden, who are unstable because of their disabilities, to come to this, and who are not able to come to the sanctuary. End of chapter. Chapter 9. What his X-ray sight reveals. Fricker, in addition to being clairaudient, proved by his hearing of the voice, is also clairvoyant, but this psychic gift has a much more recent origin. It has displayed itself since he began his healing mission. He cannot induce it. The faculty functions of its own accord when it is necessary for him to know what is exactly wrong with the patient. Then he can gaze into the inside of the body just as if he possessed X-ray sight. It is in no way connected with physical vision because he can see clairvoyantly whether his eyes are open or closed. I asked him to describe the kind of result he obtained when his clairvoyance operated. With one patient he noticed that the liver had patently deteriorated. With another, and this was a case where doctors weren't able to make a diagnosis, he could see that there was an internal growth. Frequently he has actually looked at the stones that lodge in the gallbladder. When there is a blood complaint, he watches the valves of the working pump, the heart, and sees a stream of blood circulating from it. As you can readily imagine, this is a most valuable gift, especially in many cases where the medical inability to suggest treatment is due to the fact that doctors could not correctly diagnose the complaint. Here he made a valuable point. I am shown where the cause of the trouble lies, not the effect, which may be in a different part of the body. As a simple illustration, he mentioned that a painful arm or leg was often due to a spine being out of alignment. Occasionally, a diagnosis is given in another manner when the patient's afflictions are transferred and registered on Fricker's body. This provides a first-hand indication of the trouble and can be a painful experience, albeit a temporary one, and it stimulates a compassion for suffering, which is an indispensable requisite for a healer's function. Why does your healing mostly consist in what I call rubbing? I asked. Occasionally he does make healing passes. Fricker's explanation was that rubbing enabled the spirit power to flow through his body more quickly. He does not have to rub hard, but barely touch the body. When he is doing so, he said, he experiences a sensation of terrific heat. This is frequently felt by the patients, who also report that they experience what they describe as tremendous vibration. One of the most controversial aspects of his healing is his use of a radiogram and his playing of records of popular music, often tunes which are the latest to include among the top 10. Never is his choice a soothing melody, a hymn, or any other kind of sacred music. I play the radiogram, said Fricker, when I am told the patient needs stronger power. I choose tunes which appeal to me. I know that classical music is unsuitable. I am by nature a lively fellow, always anxious to get things done quickly. So the music has to be of that type. Moreover, the popular melodies have their appeal for the public, which constitutes the largest number of my patients. Here I intervene to observe that these melodies would jar and irritate patients who loathe rock and roll, and it would seem not make them conducive to healing simply because they would be out of harmony. As an example, I cited the case quoted in a previous chapter of Arias, the concert pianist, who found to dismay that Fricker was playing a record which has been popular on a continent and which he intensely disliked. Fricker's answer was short and simple. Yes, but he was cured just the same. I play primarily for my benefit. It does something to me. These pop songs provide the vibration that I require. I get the right reaction, and as a result, the power that comes through me is really terrific. Here he added an interesting sidelight which indicates a spirit technique involved in his healing. He explained that the power comes through my heart, which indicates in some way or another that it is connected with a life force. I have always believed that one of the means by which spirit healing is accomplished is that the power coming through the medium stimulates the patient's life force to enable it to discharge its function of making the body self-recuperative. Now I tried another line of questioning. The newspaper call it faith healing. But this cannot be true when you have to deal with so many skeptics and children who, because they are too young, cannot have faith in you or the power that uses you. Fricker answered, in a sense it is faith healing, but it is I who must have faith. I am successful because I have faith which is based on experience, especially when I must tell patients they are cured after they have been rejected by doctors and hospitals. My faith consists in telling patients what the voice tells me. It must be, so far as I am concerned, 100% faith. Otherwise, I would not be completely cooperating with the power that uses me. I must have the faith to be able to say to a patient, go back to your hospital and have an X-ray to prove I am right, or tell the sufferers from duodenal ulcers that they can now eat and what they like to demonstrate that they have been cured. It is not necessary for the patients to have faith. As an instance of the necessity for his faith, he mentioned one of his earlier cases, Mrs. Margaret Durkheim of Edgeworth, Middlesex, after she broke the neck of a thigh bone, spent 6 weeks in a hospital while the bone was pinned, but unfortunately it did not heal. Another operation, this time for grafting, was contemplated. It was then that Mrs. Durkheim left the hospital wearing a caliper and unable to walk except with great difficulty. She is brought to Fricker, who immediately told her, "As you have had such a severe operation, I cannot promise any results." Here he touched the exact spot where the bone had been broken. Mrs. Durkheim was so susceptible about healing that she thought it was only for those who were hysterical by nature. Nevertheless, she said that when Fricker's hand touched the bone, it was like an electric shock to her, and that sensation lasted for 3 hours. After 3 visits, Fricker told her to have another x-ray taken. "It will show slight improvement," he said. Mrs. Durkheim did as she was told. The surgeon confirmed that the latest x-ray revealed a slight improvement. There followed 4 further treatments, after which Fricker said, "Now have another x-ray taken, because it should reveal considerable improvement." Again the surgeon confirmed the healer's statement. 3 weeks later, Fricker told her that the bone was completely healed. To prove the cure, he said, she should now return to her medical man and demand one more x-ray. The following week she came with her husband to visit Fricker to relate how disappointed they were. As instructed, she had visited her doctor and had another x-ray taken, and had been informed categorically that she was not cured. This puzzled Fricker. It seemed that for the first time his voice had given him wrong information. Mentally he asked, "Why did you tell me that she was cured? The x-ray plate reveals that she is not cured." The voice, however, was insistent. "Tell her to go back to the doctor and demand that he makes a proper examination of the x-ray plate. She is cured." When Fricker repeated this information, the husband asked, "Are you trying to tell me that an x-ray plate can be wrong?" This was a test for the healer, who answered, "If I am told she is cured, then she is cured. I have never found my voice to be wrong." His invisible inspirer was not finished. Fricker was asked to remove the woman's caliper and the shoe on the other leg. This was done. Next, holding her hands and following the voice's direction, Fricker asked her to take the good leg off the ground while she stood on the affected one. Mrs. Durkheim hesitated and finally complied with the request. Then she was asked to raise herself right on the tiptoe of the bad leg, with the good one remaining suspended in the air. She did so, maintaining the position for a few minutes. When both feet were returned to the ground, Fricker asked her if she had felt any pain or soreness. "No," was her answer. Next, she was asked to do a series of exercises with the bad leg, including forcefully pressing the foot against the healer's hand and pushing it back. Finally, she walked slowly but unaided up and down the room. "You have convinced me now," said the husband. "I will go back with my wife to the hospital." A few days later, the Durkheims returned, thrilled and excited. "We don't know how to thank you," they said. They had seen the doctor in the hospital insisting that there must be some mistake with the x-ray plate because they had reason to believe the leg was better. This annoyed the medico. "I have told you that your wife's leg is no better," he asserted. "What is more, I want her in the hospital to have an operation." At an earlier stage, Mrs. Durkheim had been told that if the operation was unsuccessful, the leg might have to be amputated. The husband, having witnessed a practical demonstration of his wife's cure at Fricker's house, told the doctor, "My wife is not going back to the hospital because I still believe that her leg is cured." This was too much for the doctor, who said with some heat, "If you don't want to do what I tell you, I wash my hands of this case." The Durkheims left the hospital. He telephoned another hospital and asked if an x-ray could be taken of his wife's leg without disclosing what had happened at Fricker's sanctuary. The doctor at the second hospital made an appointment for an x-ray to be taken. Later, after seeing the plaint, he sent for the husband and asked, who said the leg isn't cured. Durkheim named the doctor who made the statement. "Get your wife to take that caliper off," was the reply. "She had put it on, just to be on the safe side, and don't insult me by leaving with it on." After that experience, the only occasion of which Fricker had any doubts about the voice, his faith was unshaken and has continued so to remain. Having cross-examined him on the use of the word faith in connection with his healing, I now asked about miracles, another word frequently employed by newspapers. I pointed out that to many people who believed they had a logical outlook, what were regarded as miracles constituted a stumbling block. According to their viewpoint, God had to be all-knowing. It would be a reflection on God and evidence of imperfection if he had to perform a miracle because some unforeseen event had happened and it became necessary to interfere with the operation of a natural law to suspend or abrogate them. If he had not made provisions for everything, then God could not be all-knowing. What had Fricker to say on these points? Again, the answer was simple. What I call a miracle is when a patient comes to me after being given up by doctors and told he was only so long to live, and there is an instantaneous cure, he added. In this connection, that before he started his healing mission, he had a tremendous respect for doctors, but this had been weakened because of so many futile excuses they had proffered to try to explain away the cures. In addition to the voice, a supreme directing power in his healing, Fricker has the help of a band of spirit healers. This includes 3 individuals whose earthly lives were devoted to treating sufferers. The first of these spirit guides to reveal himself is Dr. Karl Mueller, a former German physician who lived in Hamburg and who specialized in spinal treatments. He has been seen clairvoyantly and been described by several mediums, and their descriptions confirm his appearance as he has shown himself to Fricker. What does he look like? I asked as a matter of curiosity. To Fricker, he appears to be about 60 years old, medium in height with a slim build, and always wearing a small, neat white beard. He must have lived in Victorian times, for he wears a cutaway coat. An outstanding feature is his pinna, which are fastened on a silk and black cord. When he finishes examining a patient, he always comes for spinal cases. The pinna usually falls from his nose and dangles by the cord. Then there is a man who is famous on earth, Sir Herbert Barker, the gifted but unorthodox bone setter, who, to the dismay of the medical profession which opposed him, was knighted for his service. The brand of manipulative surgery he practiced enabled him to perform bloodless operations, which made surgical and orthopedic appliances unnecessary. Incidentally, the only explanation in my view for Barker's long and successful healing career is that he possessed the healing gift, for he never had any kind of medical or osteopathic training. Fricker says he never seen Barker's photograph in any publications, but he is quite sure of his identity. He is always bluntly spoken, dislikes to be addressed by his title, which he regards as having no significance in the spirit world. What always intrigues Fricker are the fantastic things he tells me about bones. The last member of the spirit trio is Abdul Latif, a Persian physician who lived nearly 8 centuries ago in the time of Richard I. I told Fricker, who was unaware of it, that Abdul Latif had long been prominent in healing activities from the spirit world. He has worked through several mediums, one of whom obtained from him information about his earthly life. It happened after a voice seance at which Abdul Latif communicated and said that details of his earthly existence and his career could be found at the British Museum. A search of the Encyclopedia Britannica and a medical encyclopedia proved fruitless. A librarian who happened to be a learned Orientalist was consulted. In the Oriental section of the British Museum, he succeeded in finding references to this Persian physician. To me, it is always of striking significance that doctors who devoted so much of their life to removing afflictions on earth should be given an opportunity, after their passing, to continue their beneficent labors. Besides this trio, a prominent part is played by a spirit entity, Sambo, a Negro who was once a member of an African slave chain gang. Sambo acts as Fricker's doorkeeper and maintains a constant protective watch. One of his functions, said Fricker, was revealing in that it showed how anxious are the dead to reach their loved ones on earth. They crowd round Fricker when he is treating patients, and some of them try to control him in order to give a message when they see a beloved relative in the room. Sambo ensures that they are kept in check. So seemingly normal is Fricker's clairaudience that he can distinguish between the voices of Dr. Mueller, Sir Herbert Barker, Abdul Latif, and Sambo. Moreover, he told me each speaks with the same individual voice and intonation every time. I was present on an occasion when Fricker received confirmation of the presence of some of his guides. I had taken a famous medium, Lillian Bailey, to see the healer. Because she is clairvoyant, Lillian was able to outline one of the methods by which his healing is accomplished. She could see streaming through Fricker what she called spirit rays, which gradually permeated the aura surrounding the patient who was being treated. Then she referred to Dr. Mueller, and her description tallied with the one given to me by Fricker. She also told of Sambo's appearance. Again, this was as Fricker always saw him. Sambush, he said, was full of emotion and grateful for the opportunity he had of giving service. It was a red-letter day for Fricker, for Lillian Bailey was controlled by his mother, who was responsible for introducing him to the subject. I cannot reproduce her message, for they were intimate and personal. It was a touching spectacle to witness this reading between son and mother, and to hear her affectionate greeting for Fricker's wife, who was an indispensable part of his healing mission. Fricker's father also communicated with evidential messages. What was also fascinating was to listen to Dr. Tom Adamson, a former medical man who was one of Mrs. Bailey's guides, when he controlled his medium. He contrasted the medical treatment he gave when on Earth with the more accelerated and efficacious healing being done through Fricker. "You have your own niche, and it is a grand one," he said. He foretold that work that lay ahead of Fricker, who was heartened and encouraged by his communication. End of chapter. Chapter 10. Triumphs in Newspaper Tests. Not unnaturally, I am proud of the fact that I wrote the first article about Fricker's healing to appear in a widely circulated national magazine. It was published 4 years ago and illustrated, now incorporated in Today, and was entitled Health from Another World. I begin by stating that the test of spirit healing was that it must achieve permanent cures after all other means had failed. I can produce hundreds of such cases, I wrote. I described Fricker's remarkable rise to fame and told of some of the cures that I had seen accomplished in his northern London sanctuary. When I mentioned this article to Fricker the other day, he told me that as a result of it, he was still receiving requests from healing from overseas. Magazines, unlike newspapers, which are quickly perused and then most probably destroyed, continue to have a life of their own in homes and waiting rooms many years after they are published. It is amusing for me to recall how on several previous occasions I tried to induce editors of other mass-selling publications to inquire into Fricker's healing, seeing that now it is commonplace for accounts of all cures to be printed. The first real breakthrough was accomplished in January 1958, after I had told the editor of The People about Fricker's healing successes. This newspaper, which has a circulation of 5 million, one of the largest in the country, decided at my instigation to conduct an experiment. Readers suffering with slip discs were asked to write in if they wished to participate. The experiment was confined to 7 human guinea pigs, who were chosen because medical treatments had produced no relief in their cases. Fricker eagerly cooperated because this was the kind of inquiry he had long wanted. Success crowned this test. A whole-page story in The People was headed, "Cured by a Man with Miracle Hands." Bernard Eaton, a reporter who wrote the account of what he describes as a remarkable test, said that of the 7 sufferers from the painful and virtually incurable ailment, the truly staggering outcome is that 3 of these 7 have not suffered a twinge of pain since they paid a single brief visit to the spirit healer. While he could not say that they were cured or that Fricker was responsible for their remarkable freedom from pain, the facts added up to something that looks like a medical miracle. Each of the 7 had been under medical treatment. In slip disc cases, he said, doctors try to ease it back by getting the patient to lie on a bare board, by giving him a steel belt, or by surgery. In most cases, none of these methods worked. Only occasionally did the trouble cure itself by the disc slipping back. All 7 guinea pigs had tried the usual methods of getting relief. All had failed. Eaton described how Fricker operates, saying that the treatment consisted of the healer placing his hands on the patient and rubbing their back. The whole operation took 60 seconds. One patient, Miss Nettie Ram, age 44, of Hackney, East London, had been suffering from a slip disc since June the previous year. In August, she was sent to Bethnal Green Hospital, x-rayed and detained 8 weeks for treatment. This consisted of lying on a board and later of exercises. Finally, a steel belt was made for her. There was a slight improvement, but Miss Rams told the reporter, "I have been in agony despite that. I could only walk upstairs one step at a time, and the pain almost made me cry. I could never bend to put my shoes on." When the 60-second treatment ended, Fricker told her, "You are cured. Take off your steel belt and never wear it again." Miss Rams volunteered, "I feel better." After touching her toes, she added enthusiastically, "I feel wonderful. There is no pain. I couldn't possibly have done that before without pain." Fricker told her to go upstairs and take her belt off. "You can walk upstairs now, and you'll feel no pain," he said. Previously, Miss Rams could go upstairs only by holding onto the rail. Now she demonstrated her new freedom of movement. She was still enthusiastic about her cure when she returned, having removed the belt. In answer to my questions, for I was present at this experiment, she said that she had been x-rayed more than once, and the medical verdict was prolapsed discs, commonly called slip discs. Then it was the turn of Mrs. Robert Grimmer, a waitress, aged 34, from Fulham, London, southwest. Her slip disc, from which she had been suffering since the previous June, had been diagnosed both by her family doctor and by a surgeon at St. George's Hospital, London. On the August Monday, she said, I went paralyzed. They wanted her to go into a hospital for treatment, but she was unable to do so. Instead, she rested at home, sleeping on a hardwood floor instead of on boards. She had rarely worn the steel belt provided for her because it restricted her movement too much. Mrs. Grimmer said that she had been suffering agony. Even to breathe is sometimes painful, she added. Housework and washing made me cry. I feel like an old woman, and I can do so little without intense pain. One leg, she added, was like a lump of lead. She found it impossible to bend down. She could not use her fingers in the morning. If she went upstairs on a bus, she kept falling down. Fricker gave his 60-second treatment again, said Eaton. Then he told her that she was cured. Miss Grimmer raised her right leg, then her left one. She knelt down, touched her toes, swayed from side to side, things she could not have done a few moments before. Well, it's marvelous, she exclaimed. I feel lighter somehow, and there's no pain. When she expressed her gratitude, Fricker replied, Don't thank me. God has done that. John Hayes, a 40-year-old welder from Plumstead, London, southeast, had had a slip disc victim for 3 years. He had been treated at Brook Green Hospital, Shooters Hill, London, southeast. After treatment, he volunteered. I think I am better already, but I wasn't in great pain when I came here. I can't really tell. Fricker asked him to touch his toes quickly 6 times in succession. This Hayes did and said, I could not have done that before. Eaton later interviewed the patient to see how they had since fared. I want to make quite sure, he wrote, that the 3 who declared themselves so marvelously free of pain at Fricker's house were not just experiencing a momentary delusion. If it was a delusion, he added, they were given a wonderful show of pain-free living. Hayes told him that he is certain he is now completely better. The pain is gone, he said. I am like a young man again. I can do things now that I haven't done for 3 years. As the extra checked, Eaton accompanied Miss Grimmer and Miss Rims to the leading London hospital, where an eminent radiologist took X-ray pictures of their spine. He was frank enough to admit that X-ray plates could not prove anything, for, he added, X-rays cannot show a slip disc. A comparison of the plates taken before and afterward showed no difference. Both patients, he said, had all the symptoms of a slip disc, with all the pain in the right places. Now they said they had no pain whatsoever. This freedom from pain was certainly remarkable. That he declared with professional caution did not prove they were cured. The dramatic way in which they felt relief from pain tends to suggest that the pains in the first place were of a psychological origin, that in fact they never really had a slip disc at all. Doctors, he told the reporter, frequently had to base their diagnosis on what patients told them. Suggestible people can reproduce the symptoms and pains of any disease, and they are just the people who are influenced by this type of treatment. Eaton ended his account with these words. Was it suggestion, or was it spirit healing, or was it coincidence? I do not know. Well, the patients do. They have received medical treatment, either privately or in hospitals. They had been told by the doctor that they had slip discs. They had endured pain ever since. Now they rejoiced in a freedom which the newspaper called a miracle. The result of this publicity is what Fricker described as a nightmare. His telephone started to ring at 8 on Sunday morning when the account appeared and continued to ring for days afterwards. Sufferers, clutching at the hope of a cure which doctors could not achieve, called on the off chance of being treated. One even traveled all the way from Bath, over 100 miles away. Then there were the letters begging for healing that cascaded into Fricker from all over the country. In 5 days they numbered over 2,000, but this was nothing compared with the applications received by the newspaper. The post bag started with 1,000 letters with its office opened, with requests pouring in daily. Fricker solved the problem of answering this gigantic mail by enlisting voluntary help, offering the writers absent healing until such time as appointments could be made. These appointments were then scheduled at a rate of 100 a week. A few months later, the South Wales Echo recorded what it described as a miraculous cure. The patient was a skeptical Welsh ex-miner who had been in and out of plaster since he injured his spine in a colliery accident 2 years previous. Now, said the newspaper, Ronald Cowell of Tony Frail, Gloucestershire, had packed his spinal jacket and collar away in a suitcase. Cowell on sick leave for 15 months after his injury had 8 different plaster jackets in a year. He attended East Glamagore Hospital for treatment. At the end of 15 months, he was told that he would have to wear a spinal jacket probably for life. Unable to return to mining, he obtained light employment as a work-study engineer with the National Coal Board. But Cowell's ill luck was not over. He suffered a further accident at the Mestig Colliery, this time to the top of his spine and neck. Again he was treated. It lasted for 6 months at East Glamorgan Hospital, followed by a similar period at a rehabilitation center. When he came home for week's end, he could hardly walk, recalled his wife Megan. It was agony to watch him coming over the step. He was fitted with a plaster cast from chin to chest, leaving the arms and shoulders free. I was unable to turn my head without moving my body and could not bend because of the spinal support, said Cowell. More recently, the newspaper account stated, he had attended an orthopedic hospital as an outpatient and had the plaster cast removed, but he was still unable to move his head without moving his body because in place of the plaster, they put a collar. A friend persuaded him to visit Fricker. There was no bone manipulation, said Cowell. He placed his hands on my neck. It was a funny sensation. My body appeared to vibrate with unseen power. It felt like a bag of bones being rattled. Then he told me to turn my head. I was afraid to do so. Mr. Fricker told me, "You are cured." I turned my head and it was normal. He then touched the small of my back. I had the same sensation. He then told me to touch my toes. Frankly, I thought he was talking through his hat, but I did so. He said to me, "You are cured, and you can do now what you like." Now add the newspaper, Cowell could dig the garden. He planted 14 pounds of potatoes the evening after he came home from London. He could pick up his 7-year-old daughter Sheena and swing her around. He could even contemplate playing football again. He could not even stand to watch before. It's wonderful, said Cowell. I can't really believe it's happened. I've done more in these last few days than I could do in a fortnight before. I feel no ill effects, so it must be a permanent cure. I have already mentioned the healing inquiry conducted by Brian Gibson for the Newcastle upon Tyne Sunday Sun. In January 1960, during his inquiry, Gibson described the cure of Alfred Ranger of Eldson Road, London, who was employed in Kensington, Victoria and Albert Museum. On the 6th of December 1957, Ranger was taken ill on his way home on the bus. The pain in his chest grew to a degree that neared his limits of endurance. The doctor was called. He was rushed into St. Anne's Hospital, not very far from Fricker's sanctuary, and placed on the danger list. "It is coronary thrombosis," they told his wife Irene. "We can't give him long to live." But Irene was not content with the verdict. 9 months earlier, Fricker had cured her of a prolapsed disc, which had kept her in agony for months despite morphia injections and a specially designed surgical appliance. She appealed for his aid in a newer extremity. Excluding the hospital's strict rule to exclude unrelated visitors from the dangerously ill patients, Fricker spent half an hour at his bedside. From that time his pain disappeared and recovery began. Of course the doctors were amazed. Their astonishment was expressed in instruments for him to be x-rayed from head to toe in an endeavor to trace the whereabouts of the blood clot that the earlier x-rays and cardiographs had shown to exist in his system. But the clot had not moved elsewhere. It had disappeared. The dying patient's condition was testimony enough to his recovery. Instead of going to his grave, he went back to his everyday work. Gibson interviewed Ranger, the man who had been given 6 hours to live, and found him alive and well, a hearty, gray-haired 52-year-old, who with his wife could not sing loudly enough the praise of the healer. By far the most sustained investigation into Fricker's healing was conducted by the Daily Sketch. This began after it had been published 2 striking cures. The first, in September 1961, featured Margaret Clifton of Coburn Road, Wood Green, North London. 13 years of her life was spent in painful paralysis, wearing plaster cast or iron legs and steel jackets. Said the newspaper, "Last night, 4 days after specialists told her that she must lose part of her spine, Mrs. Clifton jumped for sheer joy." "I am better. This morning the mother of the 2 children told the reporter, 'Thank God it is all over.'" The reporter continued, "Neighbors watched ambulance men carry her into her home last Wednesday. Doctors had given her a month to decide about the spinal operation. Mrs. Clifton worried all night about what she should do. Doctors had promised that the operation would end the pain she had suffered since her daughter was born 13 years ago. Mrs. Clifton told her husband Norman, a coach painter, It seems dreadful to lose my spine. I can't face the rest of my life like that. So the next day she went to see Fricker. She was carried into his consulting room on a stretcher and 10 minutes later walked out unaided. When she strolled into her home, one neighbor collapsed. Her son, Clive, it was his birthday, wept. Mrs. Clifton, a registered disabled person, finished making 5 beds and doing the week's family wash and told me, for 13 years I could not sit or walk. Now I can run upstairs and walk and sit like a normal person. It's almost unbelievable. Mr. Clifton told me, I am speechless with thanks and wonder. The healer is a great man. Accompanying the accounts were 2 photographs. One showed Mrs. Clifton dancing with joy with her husband and son. The other depicted her in the act of doing something which was hitherto impossible, standing on her toes while she pegged and washed on the line. 2 months later, the Daily Sketch printed another extraordinary cure. Here it is in the newspaper's own words. Mrs. Pat Barker's greatest wish has come true. Her 4-year-old daughter, Tina, is walking. This is the finest Christmas box a mother could have. Mrs. Barker said, it is marvelous. I don't want a single present now. When Tina was a year old, Mrs. Barker of Phillip Lane, Tottenham, wondered why her daughter was not learning to walk like a normal child. Months passed and still Tina was only able to crawl. Her mother took her to the doctors. They could find nothing wrong with her and said that given time she would walk normally. But Tina was still not walking at 3. In despair, Mrs. Barker asked Fricker for help. He saw Tina several times. Then a week ago he told Mrs. Barker, take your daughter home and talk to her about me as much as you can. She is getting better. I want her to think about me and she will walk. One night when her husband Albert returned from work, Mrs. Barker ran to him in tears saying, it's true, Tina is walking, actually walking. Now too she is able to sit in a chair, which she could never do before. At last night, Tina, laughing with 3 of her 5 sisters, helped to put presents on their Christmas tree. This account was illustrated by a large picture of Tina walking to provide the best ever Christmas gift for her family. After printing these 2 cures, the Daily Sketch conducted a stringent inquiry under the title, Can God Heal Without a Doctor? It invited readers suffering from incurable disease which had been medically certified to offer themselves as patients for treatment by spirit healers. The intention was that, after the healing, the same or other doctors should examine them and pronounce whether or not a cure had been effected. At the end of the inquiry, the newspaper was able to reveal some striking successes, particularly by Fricker. One of the most dramatic results was a boy suffering from muscular dystrophy, a disease from which 20,000 children are dying. Their muscles slowly waste away, with few expecting to live beyond the age of 20. 2 months after this patient first received treatment from Fricker, it was apparent that his muscles, instead of wasting further, were improving. The school doctor confirmed the improvement in a written statement, affirming that the boy has put on 3.5 pounds in weight and his hand grip was better. A second case of muscular dystrophy, also treated by Fricker, showed betterment. This was a 4-year-old girl who had never been able to walk. Improvement began with the first treatment. Now she could do many things that were hitherto impossible and could even kick a ball. Another case concerned a 4-year-old boy suffering from leukemia. When he was taken to a hospital seriously ill, it was found that he had a hole in his heart. After 7 weeks' treatment by Fricker, the parents said that the change in their son has been amazing. Finally, I would like to make a comment on another case reported in the Daily Sketch. The patient is Mrs. Rosetta Thompson, a cancer sufferer who lives in Hackney, East London. Her story was told in this newspaper in March 1962 in the following words. The first warning that she was ill was a bout of severe stomach pains last May. Her doctor told her she had cancer. He advised an immediate operation to have the growth removed. The alternative was a course of radiation treatment, but the operation would still be necessary. I want you in now, he told her. In 6 months' time the operation will be too late. Mrs. Thompson had 1 radiation treatment. Then she went to Fricker. Nothing happened when he laid his hands on her. 4 hours later the pain suddenly went. She felt wonderful. Her husband described it. She was in terrible pain. She couldn't stand or sit without trouble. Suddenly it was as if someone had waved a wand at her, and she went for a walk around the park. On her second visit, Fricker told her, It's all taken away. You had a growth. It's not there anymore. A few days later, she was told the hospital was ready for the operation. She did not want an operation, she informed the doctor. She had been cured by a healer. Do you know you have cancer, he told her, and you have only got a few years to live. She went to hospital, but only for an examination tissue test. The next event was a letter from the surgeon in charge of her case at the hospital. It was addressed to her husband. It read, "I promise to let you know the result of the test that we did when she came up last. The microscope shows very little evidence now of persisting growth." The reporter in charge of this daily sketch investigation took Mrs. Thompson to Harley Street to be examined by a doctor utilized by this newspaper. He had already expressed his skepticism by stating that he had no belief in the existence of any divine healing power. This is his report. The medical evidence suggests that the growth has been controlled. On outward appearances, no one would think she was ill, as the evidence states. She has put on a stone in weight, which is not the normal behavior. There have been a definitely very marked psychological improvement, too, in this woman's case, as is shown by her hope for the future, which radiates from her eyes. You would think this is a clear case of spiritual healing, but this doctor was not converted, despite the fact that the patient refused to continue the essential medical treatment or have the operation which was considered imperative. The doctor believed the extraordinary comment that in his view her cure was achieved not by Fricker, but by the one radiation treatment she had received. This shows that it is virtually impossible to get a doctor to certify a cure by spiritual healing. Mark you, medical men are in difficulties. By certifying such a cure, they are admitting the inconvenient fact that results can be achieved by unorthodox means when they have failed. Moreover, they might be placing themselves in a position where they could be accused of cooperating with an unregistered practitioner, an offense regarded as so heinous by the General Medical Council that it could lead to the doctor being struck off the register. The Daily Sketch had to announce that it could not tell readers what was the verdict in all cases of doctors who had certified the diseases from which the patients in their investigation had suffered. Most of the doctors had been approached. Some ignored the others dodged the awkward issue by saying that they had not recently seen the patient. Some say that they could only give their written opinions and not to the newspaper, but to their patients. One doctor was frank enough to admit any correspondence on such matters would most certainly involve me in difficulties with the General Medical Council. After receiving that letter, the newspaper stopped writing to any more medical men. Still, when all is said and done, despite what doctors say or do not say, there is one individual who knows when he is cured. That is the patient who, with his death sentence removed, is able to live a normal and healthy life. End of chapter. Chapter 11. The Spirit Plan Behind the Healing. Silver Birch, the name Fricker chose for the house in which he lives, was the greatest tribute he could pay to a guide who has achieved fame all over the world for his simple elegance and his ability to present spirit teaching with wisdom and clarity. It was a red-letter day when Fricker and his wife were invited in 1956 to Hannah Swaffer's home circle, where Silver Birch greeted him with these words: "It is always a great pleasure to welcome into our midst those whose lives are dedicated to the spread of the power of the Spirit. You should rejoice to that you has come the opportunity of serving the Great Spirit by serving His children, whose lives have become darkened through sickness, suffering, and sorrow." Next came these words: "It has been a long search that this family brought you to the place on the path which you now occupy. Although the road has been hard, weary, and full of difficulties, you know now that the guidance of the Spirit has been with you since first you came into the world." "That is right," replied Fricker, adding it was an honor to work for the spirit world. "The realization has come," added the guide, "that you are the instrument of mighty recuperative forces, which through your willing cooperation can heal so many who think that life is hopeless for them, and that they have reached the end of the road so far as health is concerned. You have clairvoyantly seen some of these who labor with you, but behind them are others who are yet to make themselves known, and behind them are still others who will reveal themselves in the fullness of time. Each of these groups has greater power available, waiting to transmit it through you as you are ready. If I can make you realize that you are only on the fringe of what lies in front of you, you will begin to see the purpose of your mission." Then the guide stressed what he considered to be the reason for healing mediumship: to heal the body, to drive away a pain and ache, a disability, to allow health to be restored, vitality to flow through the physical frame. All this, of course, is work of great measure. But it is not the important part of healing, which is to touch the soul of the patient. The whole purpose of healing is directed towards making those sufferers realize that they are souls and not body. It is not easy. Just as the power which operates through you is spiritual in its origin, so the sufferers are also spiritual in their origin. The reason for their suffering is that they have disturbed the harmony of their living mind, body, and spirit, no longer work in the natural alignment which means health, wholeness, and symmetry of being. Many of the diseases, sicknesses, and ailments that afflict man are the result of his mind or his spirit. The trouble does not begin in the body, which is only the effect. The art of true living is to see that all aspects of man have their rightful expression. You do not heal by magic. You are the instrument of a spiritual power which operates through your spiritual nature to the spiritual nature of the sufferer. The whole process is spiritual. Every time that through your effort a soul comes into its own and is aware of its divine birthright, the real healing has taken place. If that great truth does not become clear to the one who is the recipient of the dynamic from our world, then it must be accounted a failure. I would venture to say that no real healing occurs until there is a stimulus that brings about an awakening of the divine, however small, within the person who receives the healing. You cannot, however much you desire it, be the means of curing anyone who comes within your orbit. The natural law imposes limits, restraints, restrictions, all conditioned by cause and effect. Death, as you call it, passing from one state to another, is also part of the natural law. Excepting, of course, that the children of the Great Spirit lived rightly, they would not be subject to disease. They would die when they were spiritually ready for the next stage of their being. There is a great work to be done, far greater than even you realize. You can have the privilege of cooperating with higher beings whose very presence will bring into your life a radiance that cannot be seen on earth. End of chapter. Chapter 12. God provides a second chance. Fricker has an unusual psychic gift, the ability to smell out disease. Though I have known him for years, it was the first time he had mentioned his faculty, and it was revealed in an unexpected way, as I will explain. To give you a picture of what his normal working day is like, I spent a few hours with him while he gave treatments. No prearrangement was made, so that what I witnessed was routine for him. Watching his procession of humanity's rejects, those for whom the doctor had pronounced the dreaded verdict that they could do no more, but God had provided a second chance, I experienced an overwhelming sense of gratitude for my own normal good health. If you who read these words are fortunate enough not to suffer from any of the varied afflictions which plague so many people, you too should thank God for this priceless possession. With good health you can do anything, but without it, life is drear. Into the healing sanctuary hobbled a man with a stick as a support. His was a pitiful tale. For 4 years he had been in and out of 7 hospitals and seen 39 specialists. Not one of them could diagnose his complaint. It was something with an unknown origin, was all they could be told. His own doctor said, "Enjoy yourself while you can." Alas for this advice, he discovered that the distance he could walk gradually diminished. "What is wrong with him?" I later asked Fricker. "Sclerosis," he replied, "because I can smell it." There was no physical odor, he explained. Throughout the years he had discovered that every disease brought its accompanying smell, and it was one of the means by which he could diagnose. This man was a case where the healing would be protracted but finally successful, said Fricker. The patient had been receiving treatment for 8 months, at first every 3 weeks and now every fortnight. The result, the sufferer told me, was that some days he noticed there was an improvement. The best news, however, was that he was able to walk, for there was a time when he feared his affliction would end his ability to earn a living. Fricker explained that to date the healing had acted as a check and prevented the condition from getting worse. Sclerosis, which alas is medically incurable, is a hardening of the connecting tissues. The fact that its spread had been halted was in itself a triumph for the spirit power that flows through Fricker. I asked this patient how he had heard of the healer. It was the usual answer, word-of-mouth recommendation, the means by which the healer's fame had spread, until national newspapers featured some of his cures. The patient's wife worked with a woman whose son had been cured of leukemia, or cancer of the blood, and had been successfully treated for this disease, which is also medically incurable. I wish I had the gift of clairvoyance while I sat there watching this pathetic procession of men, women, and children receiving the benediction of spirit power. Outwardly, there was no sign that anything supernormal was happening. Yet here was a sacred ground, more hallowed even than cathedrals, churches, chapels, temples, and synagogues, for the living power of the Spirit, as in Bible days, was streaming through a receptive channel. If all religious edifices were truly fulfilling their function, instead of reciting dead creeds, they would be vessels for the spirit power which, divine in origin, can change the course of human lives and indeed of history. The small room devoted to healing presents an extraordinary scene. It contains evidence of the gratitude of healed patients as shown in their gifts. In one niche, there is a large plaster representation of Jesus showing the Sacred Heart. This obviously came from a Roman Catholic who presumably had committed a mortal sin by receiving ministrations from a spirit healer. Still other Roman Catholics must have been equally guilty, for there is a bottle containing water from Lourdes, a small statue of Jesus also with the Sacred Heart, crucifix, rosaries, and a plaque with a Madonna and a child with one candle. Jewish patients have presented Fricker with a representation of the Ten Commandments in Hebrew in the form of 2 tablets, complete with the shield of David, and a candelabra designed to hold 8 candles, which is said to typify an incident in ancient times when oil miraculously appeared. The religious note is maintained by a large framed picture of Jesus, a copy of the Lord's Prayer, a large cross above a mirror, and a biblical scene in wood sent from Israel. For some unknown reason, there is also a statuette of Gandhi. When I inquired the reason for it, Fricker said, "Well, he lived a very good life, didn't he? And a patient gave it to me." The wall is also adorned by 2 psychic drawings of his guides, Abdul Latif and Sambo, occupying a prominent position in text from Joshua, which was recited by a medium to Fricker on the red letter day when he paid his visit to the small spiritualist church and was told of his healing gift. There is the radiogram, the presence it has caused so much controversy, which he uses when he wants the vibration from the records he plays. And there is the piano stool on which thousands of patients have sat, and which is indispensable to his healing. Nearby is a bowl filled with cold water into which Fricker plunges his hands after every treatment. This is not only a sanitary precaution, it also gets rid of vibrations that could be troublesome. Always the room is filled with flowers, adding their cheerful hues and pleasant scent. In the crowded waiting room, its walls covered with framed accounts of healings that have appeared in the press, there is an excellent reproduction of Doré's famous picture of praying hands. There are 2 more pictures of Jesus, the first with a modern touch, showing him healing children, one of them a boy with a newspaper under his arm. By the window, seated at a typewriter, is Fricker's youthful but imperturbable secretary, always cheerful despite this constant atmosphere of pain and suffering. She loves her job because she likes meeting people. Besides, her father was cured by Fricker. Even if you were a stranger passing 40 Howard Road by chance, you would realize that something unusual takes place within. At any time of the day, there are cars drawn up on both sides of the road. Before the outer door is open, there is inevitably a small queue of patients, who, even though they have appointments, are determined to be so early as to not miss the opportunity of receiving treatment. Apart from the crowded waiting room with its score of chairs taken and people standing, there are frequently sufferers also waiting in a small hallway. Intermittently throughout the day, the telephone bell rings with people asking the same question: "When can I see Mr. Fricker?" What distinguishes the house from all others in the road is a plate announcing Fricker's Healing Center, E.G. Fricker, spiritual healer by appointment only. I have mentioned the speed with which patients are treated, an extraordinary sight to witness. On this occasion, however, it had to be slowed down because I was interviewing patients to get their stories. In nearly every case, Fricker was dealing with a so-called incurable disease. This brought fresh realization of the large number of people there must be condemned to ill health simply because of medicine's limitations. Never once did Fricker become impatient. Always he was jovial and genial and superbly confident. If a sufferer seemed to be miserable, he would make a joke, as for example, with a wink to me he said to a Jewish patient, "Aren't you Roman Catholic?" At the end of each treatment there was a friendly pat on the back. I noticed his constant natural courtesy in helping people to put on their coats and opening the door for them to leave. If he has any preference in giving treatment, it is reserved for children. His face lit up when he welcomed 2 of them. One born a Mongol baby ran eagerly to him, placed his head in Fricker's lap and waited for healing. The other, a child born deaf, laughed as he could feel the healing power being transmitted to him. The mother of the Mongol child, now 5 years old, told me that before coming to Fricker he could neither walk nor speak and was always listless. The boy, now a happy child, eagerly greeted him, and he has reached a stage where he is almost forming words. His parents can understand everything he said. In the 2 years since Fricker began treatment, the improvement has been consistently progressive. If it had not been for Mr. Fricker, said the mother, I would have been in a mental home. Specialists had told her that there was nothing they could do. Wait and see what happens was the only comfort they could give, followed by a chilling announcement. He will never lead a normal life. Fricker has proved them wrong. All told, I watched a score of patients being treated, and each had a story of betterment to relate because they were witnessing how slowly but surely their afflictions yielded to the healing. The first was a case of muscular dystrophy in which inevitably there is a progressive wastage. Hospital treatments had proved abortive. Yet in the 4 months since he visited Fricker, the patient told me that he was walking better and could see the improvement being made. He was followed by a sprightly young woman from Wales who was specially staying in London to receive the healing. She too was a sclerosis case, who previously could walk only slowly and with a bowed head. She had been coming for only 2 months, yet the improvement was obvious. Anxious to return to Wales, she asked, How long will it take me to get right? Fricker replied, Well, that is up to God. Next came a woman with a rare complaint, a hernia in the diaphragm, for which she had been informed that an operation would be too dangerous and difficult. Previously, it was almost impossible to retain any food she ate, and its consumption made her blue in the face. Now eating was almost normal. In 4 months she had reached a stage where she could say, I am 1,000,000 times better. I used to pray that I might die. Now I am a different woman. Mr. Fricker has worked wonders with me. There was another case of muscular dystrophy, a middle-aged woman who had been afflicted with it since she was a little girl. She came in slowly with a back almost as stiff as a ramrod. When I was introduced to her, she said, Oh, he's making me better. Affectionately, she patted him as she said, Good old boy. I admire her pluck and her enthusiasm, for now she had the confidence that she would become well. I have to, she said. I have 4 children to look after, 3 of my own and 1 a colored child whom I adopted. Now it was the turn of a post office sorter wearing part of his uniform. The doctors, because of his failing sight, wanted him to have an operation. A first aid man with whom he worked advised him instead to consult Fricker. The result was that the deterioration had been checked in the eye, where the sight would have now vanished. He was able to continue his job, into which his vision is of paramount importance. Accompanied by his wife, a young man slowly walked in, smiling as he greeted Fricker. He was another of these medical rejects. 6 years ago his spine began to curve and gradually worsened. For the last 3 years it was pronounced and painful. He used to be like a knot, said his wife. They read about Fricker in the Daily Sketch, and since then, she said, we have never looked back. In less than 3 months she had seen her husband become a growing, living marvel. The spine had gradually straightened to the extent that his height was increased by 7 inches. The medical name for his complaint is spondylosis, which means that the vertebrae become inflamed. Now, because of Fricker's healing, he knew that he was on the road to recovery. Next, it was turn of an arthritic sufferer, a woman who announced, Mr. Fricker has done marvels for me. Since 1953, she had taken so many drugs that I had a chemist shop inside me. She used to be lopsided with a bent spine. When first she came 2 years earlier, she had to be brought by car. Now, however, she walked home, for she lives in a neighboring district. With the 13th patient, I heard Fricker pronounce the glad news for which each waited. You are cured. This was a woman, a slip disc sufferer, who had also contracted arthritis of the spine. She used to wear a special belt, but no longer does so. Fricker always insists that slip disc sufferers should remove their spinal belts and jackets because he regards them as impediments to the healing. Hitherto she could only sleep on by having a board in her bed. Her trouble had lasted for 8 years. Now on her 4th visit she was discharged, she told me. It's wonderful after a good night's sleep to get up in the morning and stand up and stretch. You could not tell from her smiling face that the patient who followed her was a heart sufferer who already had undergone 1 operation. Valvular disease of the heart was her trouble. Both valves, she was told, were damaged, and she was due to have a 2nd operation in 3 months' time. Moreover, there was an added ailment. Since she was a child, she had suffered from psoriasis, a chronic and inflammatory skin disease for which there is no orthodox cure. This has slowly begun to improve. When I see the doctor, I will tell him that I am not going to have the 2nd operation, she said. Even my husband sees a big difference in me, was her testimony. What do you think of Fricker? I asked. Her answer was short but revealing. I have been looking for this man all my life. How did she hear of him? Again, the daily sketch can congratulate itself as being the means through which she found the road to health. Only one more treatment is needed, Fricker told the patient who succeeded her. This, too, was a woman with kidney and liver trouble. Her journey usually took 2 hours, yet she cheerfully made it, for on this, her 4th visit, she knew that her health trouble were almost conquered. The last patient I saw had a revealing story to tell. Originally, she came to Fricker because she was not only a victim of disseminated sclerosis, but had also gone completely blind. Doctors had informed her that she could expect to be paralyzed for the rest of her life. The only hope they could hold out was that she could be not bedridden until she was 60. Now at 37, Fricker had contradicted the medical verdict by curing her both of sclerosis and blindness. There is no doubt about his success, for annually she had to visit the hospital for a routine check, and they discharged her. Why then had she come back to Fricker? The answer in itself was proof of a cure. In helping her husband to decorate the ceiling, she had strained a muscle. Fricker put it right. As I left, I walked into the waiting room filled with patients. A little child was amusing them with his antics. My eye caught a new handwritten poster, the work of a cured patient. It was simple but effective. Above there were 3 words, Fricker's Healing Center. From the capital letter of each word came a line to indicate the message, faith, hope, and charity. When I inquired, I found the sufferers came not only from all over Britain but from abroad. Here is a list of countries which had produced their quotas. France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Holland, Sweden, South Africa, America, Cyprus, Denmark, Canada, United States, Austria, Australia, Egypt, Mexico, Italy. The list itself is evidence on how the fame of this healing was spread. Before leaving the sanctuary, I decided to conduct a one-man poll by taking a sample, a handful at random from the morning's post bag. This, I thought, would provide the best indication of the kind of correspondence Fricker receives. I ignore for the purpose of this book the letters requesting appointments for healing. In each case, the writers had read about Fricker or heard him from a friend or relative who had been cured. Mostly the writers reported the progress that had been made by absent healing. The first from Somerset said, "Such a wonderful healing condition has now been established that they can remove my name from your list." A man from Derby not only stated that his progress continued, but there was improvement in the cases of 3 other friends for whom he had requested absent treatment. A woman from Exeter reported with delight that not only was there improvement, but an absence of pain which enabled her to get around much better. "My daughter is making progress," announced a Yorkshire woman, who added for the first time for months she had been able to get out of bed. Since she had received God's spiritual healing power, she was done remarkably well, wrote her mother. From Bucks came the news. "My mother is still progressing well and feeling very well. My husband is just a little bit relieved, but only just a little." It is pitiful to read some of the letters, for the writers are clutching at the straw of hope which they feel Fricker will provide. They are either bedridden, incapacitated, or so stricken that life has lost its glow. Many of them have tried everything and seen everybody, and now in their darkness has come the glimmer of light because somewhere they have read about Fricker, or someone has described his success. They learn about him, even in the strangest places. One tells of hearing Fricker's name for the first time in a hospital. To another it was mentioned while at a funeral. The news has been spread by office colleagues in factories, workshops, and by tradesmen. There is no point in quoting their letters. Instead, I content myself by citing those who describe what happens from the moment that spirit power intervened, even though distance separated healer and patient. A mother in Essex reports a slight improvement in her epileptic daughter, who had only 1 treatment and is now on the absent healing list. Faithfully she tells the healer she tunes into him nightly by gazing at his photograph. From Sussex comes the news again. It is a mother writing that Jackie's chest is a little better because his cough is not so persistent. Moreover, there is an improvement in his digestion. The scene changes to Surrey with the report of a noticeable improvement after the first time absent healing was received, for the patient announced that she was conscious of a tingular sensation at the top of her head with other peculiar feelings. The result was that she could eat a little food, which had almost been impossible, was sleeping easier, beginning to talk and to meet people. I like the next line, which reads, "My doctor is very pleased, as he was responsible for these results." There is an amusing letter from a schoolboy in Surrey who begins, "Hope you are well, I am getting well." He reports that at 9 a.m., the time for absent healing, I heard something for a few seconds, but boyishly does not describe what he heard, although he adds, this happens very often. He gives news of his parents' visit on open day, of the football match which was won by his house, and the film he saw a few days earlier. My eye was caught in the pile of letters by the only one that was typewritten, from a patient in Kent expressing appreciation for the wonderful help I have received through Mr. Fricker. I have been feeling much better, and am conscious of the upliftment each day, which has been received with deep gratitude. I asked for a list of the countries from which requests from absent healing has come. The reply again was indicative of how the good news is spread. Here it is: France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Holland, Sweden, South Africa, Belgium, America, Cyprus, Japan, Denmark, Canada, Switzerland, United States, Jamaica, India, Pakistan, Finland, Greece, Austria, Australia, New Zealand, Egypt, Persia, Mexico, Italy, Malaysia, Ghana, and Israel. I also inquired for a list of diseases which had been successfully treated. My intention was to detail them. There is no point in doing so. It includes all the well-known afflictions and many that are obscure. What the list does reveal is that so far as spirit healing is concerned, there are no incurable diseases. End of chapter. Chapter 13. The Miracle That Is Miranda Moore. This astonishing case of Miranda Moore deserves a chapter to itself. Perhaps the best way to introduce it is to reprint the account I originally published in Two Worlds in April 1957, after my attention had been drawn to it by her mother. Then at the end I will give you the mother's comments that bring the dramatic story of her up to date. Here is what the reporter wrote after visiting Miranda Moore's home in Onslow Gardens, London. Every medical expert called in to examine Miranda said she was bound to die. I met Miranda the other day. Perhaps I gazed too much at her shapely legs. Maybe we should not have held hands so long. That kiss I gave her may not have been quite the thing coming from a complete stranger, but those legs were once weak and wasted, and fingers twitched in fit after fit, and the kissable mouth dribbled uselessly. Yes, I fell in love with Miranda as soon as I met her, for with her first breath this intelligent, pretty little creature told me she had taken the day off from school especially to see me, that we could now read her Rupert book together, and that she would be 5 in August. Of course, nowadays we do not believe in miracles, but if there were such happenings, Miranda's 5th birthday would be high among them, because just over a year ago the doctor told her mother, "I shouldn't worry about it with too much food. There's no point in it now. Just try and get used to the idea that she cannot live very long." It was soon after her 3rd birthday that Miranda's mother noticed something was wrong. They were at lunch in their home when she saw the child's arms stiffen and quiver, and for a few moments she was not with us. The doctor examined Miranda and told her mother to watch her for a few days. It soon became obvious that she was losing control of her left arm and hand and experiencing what were termed fits of an epileptic character, that is, resembling epilepsy. She was put on phenobarbital and sent to a neurologist for examination. These attacks increased in number and severity, leaving Miranda more and more exhausted. She was having about 8 to 10 attacks daily and more throughout the night. In spite of being watched closely by the family, she had many bad falls, often injuring her face and head. She went down like a 9-pin without using her arms or hands, her mother told me. She would lose consciousness from 1 to 2.5 minutes. Towards the end, her face was horribly contorted. Her eyes rolled and her limbs jerked spasmodically. Often she would cry after an attack. Miranda had lost the use of her left leg, and her head was beginning to roll a little, with the neurologist passed to her neurosurgeon at a London hospital. This expert offered to take her in for observation, warning Mrs. Moore that this might be lengthy and not without risk. At the end of it, he might well have to tell her he could do nothing. It was for her to make the decision. Well, there was really no decision, and on the 23rd of October 1955, Miranda entered the hospital. After many x-rays and electrical tests, the surgeon informed Miranda's parents that in a child of her age, the symptoms seemed to indicate a brain tumor. He explained gently and kindly just what this meant. An ordinary tumor might be operable. A malignant tumor was inoperable and would cause death in a few months, maybe less. In the event of it being malignant, the exploratory operation he proposed making would be in all probability precipitate death, and should he proceed. It was not an easy decision to make, but Miranda's parents agreed to the operation, and after an almost intolerable 24-hour suspense were told that no tumor had been found. Their relief was not shared quite so wholeheartedly by the doctor, who explained that now the field of curable or treatable cause was narrowing. Even though tests had located the part of the brain responsible for the fits, the removal of this was risky. One might stop the fits but deprive the child of sight or the use of her limbs. He proposed testing for a blocked artery, which he did without success, and then suggested waiting a while as the disease was changing but could not at present be diagnosed. In September, Mrs. Moore had written to a medium asking for absent healing from Miranda and was receiving great comfort from his letters. But as the whole thing was a new and experimental measure, she told no one, not even her husband, not wishing to raise hopes unduly or to become involved in an argument. Despite the absent healing and the prayers of relatives, friends, and neighbors, Miranda's condition worsened. Roman Catholics organized special novenas, sent holy medals, relics, Lourdes water. The celebrated Father Pio, the Italian priest who is credited with many miracles of healing, and some nuns of the Isle of Wight, added to their prayers to those of Protestants, Quakers, Christian Scientists, and spiritualists. All seemed touched by the tragedy that had befallen this little, previously healthy girl. No less sparing in their efforts were her many Jewish friends. It was when her speech became slurred and difficult that the possibility of a rare disease was suspected. Miranda was immediately sent to a London hospital specializing in nervous diseases, where a great brain surgeon examined her and confirmed the possibility of this, though he said it was too early to be certain. Meantime, blindness was a constant fear. So was mental deficiency. There seemed little hope of recovery. But now Miranda's left hand and arm were useless, and the right were not much better. Since it was too dangerous for her to be out of bed, she remained most of her time in hospital in a cot. During the month she was there, her mother spent every afternoon and evening with her, even taking her to the grounds in a nearby park. Since there were no further tests to be made, it was decided that Miranda should return home. There was the assurance that at any time she could return to the hospital. There were 2 other children at home, and it was assumed that at some stage Miranda would get beyond the care of her mother. Miranda returned home on the 18th of November, and for the first 2 weeks seemed to improve slightly. It was only a temporary betterment, however. Daily she then began to get terribly weak, limp, and helpless. She never laughed now and spoke as little as possible, having difficulty in making herself understood. She was heart-renderingly sad little object to remember her mother. The few people who visited her were upset and often in tears. On the 3rd of December, Mrs. Moore took Miranda to see Fricker. Her baker, who lives in the same road as Fricker, had suggested he might be able to help. Fricker told Miranda, as Mrs. Moore briefly told him the story. Then the healer handed the child back almost casually and said, "Don't worry, she'll be all right, I feel it." Miranda had 2 fits on the way to his house, recalls Moore. "I could hardly speak. I wondered if he realized how ill she was. He told me he understood how anxious I must be, but that I should not worry as it would affect the child. Again he assured me that she would recover. The following week I again visited him, but was unable to tell him of any improvement. Then, in a 3rd visit a fortnight later, Mrs. Moore mentioned her daughter's spine. Fricker felt this, the mother recalled, and said it was the cause of the trouble. When his hands passed over a certain part of it, they vibrated. He was confident I should see signs of improvement shortly. Later that month, the neurosurgeon examined Miranda and told Mrs. Moore, "You must face the fact she is not going to get better." He still could not give the precise nature of the disease, he said, but it was one of a group that effects of which were much the same and invariably fatal. In simple terms, she would lose the use of her body and then her senses. There was nothing anyone could do, no known cause, no treatment. When she got back beyond her mother's care, she would be taken into hospital. He gave her a matter of months. Miranda was passed back to the neurologist. He examined her the Friday before Christmas and said he would see her again as soon as he returned from holiday on the 16th of January, 1956. He confirmed that the child's condition was hopeless, that it would not be kind to say otherwise. The signs were too marked, he declared, adding, "Be careful of quacks. Don't part with money to anyone who says they can cure her. No one can do anything for her now." Miranda continued to sink. She was much weaker and could swallow only with difficulty. She dribbled constantly. Her bowels were so sluggish that no drug had any effect. Feeding took hours. She began thin and flabby. Her knees knocked and she staggered when she walked. When her mother put her down on the street to alter her position, she sank to the ground. Came Christmas Day, and the marvel happened. Miranda's father, determined to make her last Christmas a good one, spared no expense in decorating the room and a magnificent tree. Miranda received so many presents from family members and sympathizers that 4 months later she still hadn't seen them all. On Christmas morning, Miranda was too weak to sit up in her cot unaided and could not handle her stocking. What happened then? What happened in the space of 1 hour, maybe 1 minute, maybe 1 second, that glorious Christmas morning? No one knows, but at lunch Miranda ate largely and with relish, swallowing easily. That afternoon, for the first time in months, her mother did not have to hold her every time she moved. Wonder of wonders, she had no fits. I did not rush through the house shouting, "She's going to be all right, I know she is," said Mrs. Moore, but none the less the feeling was there, strong and persistent. It took hold of me, and from then on I ceased to worry. This sense of elation I kept to myself. I don't think I had the courage to share it. Anyway, it wasn't difficult. I had learned something about controlling my feeling. Having lived in close contact with Miranda during her illness, my husband had recognized, apart from the verdict of medical science, that she was dying. Each day the signs had become more marked, partly because he did not want to expose himself or me to the possibility of such a bitter disappointment. But by the end of the week he could not deny that a great change had taken place. On Boxing Day, Miranda's brother, 10-year-old Roger, asked if he could take her for a walk. He was devoted to her and played a large part in the constant attention she required. Mrs. Moore took yet another chance when she was casually agreed. In half an hour they returned, laughing and happy. "Mummy, she walked all through Queen's Woods and the other woods and had a swing," said Roger, "and she didn't have one fit." Miranda recovered rapidly. The speed, almost more than the actual recovery, made her mother feel more that there was something abnormal, phenomenal about it. She had never wholly accepted that she would die, but without looking too far into the future, she did think the way back would be slow, painful, and perhaps not complete. Yet on the 1st of January, 1956, Miranda started to feed herself. She regained completely the use of her right arm and leg. The power was also fast returning to her left arm. She held up her head and ceased to dribble. The fits ceased abruptly, though the last few had been less severe and shorter, coming only at night. By the 8th of January, it was no longer necessary to keep records, as Mrs. Moore had done meticulously. Speech returned slowly. They all helped, making her repeat slurred words more clearly. They also had exercise, game which she loved. These aided her in learning to use and control the powers returning to her body she was inclined to manage without using her left arm and leg, inactive for so long a time. She had to take sweets, toys, etc. with the left hand, pick up small objects like coins or buttons, and so on. There was much to relearn, but by the end of January, speech became quite normal. When she visited Fricker soon after Christmas, Miranda was able to run on the road, whereas before she had been carried. On buses, she flung out both arms, shouting, "Look what I can do," rejoicing in her newfound movement. On January 16th, Mrs. Moore took Miranda to see the neurologist. He was astonished, but warned of the possibility of a relapse. He urged her to continue the drug, but she told him she had practically discontinued this as soon as the child showed signs of improvement. She mentioned the spirit healing. His comment was that, while not wishing to undermine her faith in things spiritual, at the same time he could not really credit them with the remarkable change that had taken place. The same day Mrs. Moore took Miranda to see the neurosurgeon, and was touched by his obvious delight in the change in Miranda. He too warned of the danger of a relapse, and was non-committal when she mentioned spirit healing. "Let us say the position is now more than hopeful," smiled the neurosurgeon as Mrs. Moore left. Early in January, Mrs. Moore took Miranda to her family doctor. He examined her and was convinced that the change was miraculous. He called his wife and family. They all looked and marveled while Miranda pottered around, every moment testifying to the wonderful change that had taken place. Then the great brain surgeon, who had been the last in line of doctors to examine Miranda, did so again, and asked if she had received any treatment. "I once again mentioned spirit healing," says Mrs. Moore. I reiterated the fact that it was the speed of recovery that had impressed me. I think he was impressed himself. All this was over a year ago, and there had been no relapse. Within 3 months of being given up, Miranda had started a day nursery. When Mrs. Moore asked the teacher, "Do you find Miranda normal?" she answered, "Perfectly normal. Why do you ask?" Miranda still goes for periodic checkups. After one of these, the neurologist turned to a sturdy, chubby-cheeked little girl, smiled, and jokingly said, "Oh, go away. I'm busy with sick people." This is how the reporter's account ended. When I told Mrs. Moore that I would like to include the story in this book together with her comments that would bring it up to date, she replied that it was a wonderful idea for a book to be written on Fricker, and it was high time it was done. She added, however, it will take some clever writing to present this sensational man and his sensational work without sensationalism. You must judge whether I have succeeded in fulfilling these conditions. Mrs. Moore tells me that since the story about Miranda appeared in Two Worlds, she has kept in touch with a hospital where a periodical examination of her daughter has been made. During the summer of 1960, Miranda complained of an odd sensation in her left arm akin to pins and needles, and it seemed as if there was a very slight but momentary loss of power. In the month of August, while Miranda was staying with relatives in the country, word came that the child had suffered 2 attacks. On one occasion that she fell and was unable to get up for a time. On the following day she experienced something which had the appearance of a fit. I will not dwell on the effect of this news, said Mrs. Moore. We brought her home, had her examined at once, and Mr. Fricker agreed to treat her. He was not concerned, said the condition was not serious and would pass. The hospital supplied some tablets to be taken by Miranda. During the next few months there were signs that all was not completely well. The child's arm would stiffen suddenly, and she would swagger. Since she was now 8 years old, a strong and apparently very healthy child had been doing well at school and leading a completely normal life. The parents were concerned to know what to do for the best. Even the slightest attack, coming at an awkward moment, like crossing a road, could be disastrous. Yet to treat her as a case and accompany her everywhere seemed to be dangerous in other ways. When Miranda returned to school in September, her mother explained matters there. It was agreed that the child should at least not climb ropes in a gymnasium or indulge in other activities that could cause a strain. At the hospital, Miranda was extensively and exhaustively tested. While the electroencephalograms, or graphs of electric impulses that accompany brain activity, showed considerable abnormality, the physical test, reaction, balance, and so on, and her vision were 100%. Mrs. Moore had the supreme satisfaction of hearing the surgeon dictate these findings during his examination. Miranda was examined monthly, then 3 monthly, and then a half-year interval. By Christmas the attacks were either gone or under control. Fricker, who had been seeing Miranda regularly, finally announced that she need not come any more, and he was also sure that she did not need the prescribed tablets. At the hospital, however, the medical authorities urged her to continue with the tablets since she was doing so well. It seemed that the longer she could be kept free of the recurrence, the better were her chance of a complete recovery. She still takes the tablets, writes the mother, though to all intents she is quite recovered. Miranda is a very ordinary child of good average intelligence, and musical. There follows a typical mother's touch. She is also lazy and untidy as any child of 9, but she is rather better adjusted and mentally balanced than many children, certainly more so than her elder brother and sister at her age. Since knowing Fricker, she says, I have had many occasions to be grateful to him for his treatment of friends and their friends. Always I am impressed by his sincerity and generosity. He has the power to inspire great confidence. I had come into contact with 4 doctors during the 5 months that Miranda was under their treatment. I liked them all and found them full of kindness and sympathy, but they did not inspire confidence and were all, in fact, obviously preparing me to accept the inevitable. I have very vivid memories of the long talks I had with them, the nature of which all pointed to the extreme hopelessness of the child's chance of recovery. The effect of these repeated confirmations was a kind of numbing of the feeling, the shock that was there but always suppressed. Mr. Fricker, almost casual remarks had the opposite effect, and I had difficulty in controlling myself. She ends by saying that if there were any way in which she could help Fricker or his work, she would regard it as a privilege. I have deliberately given all the details of this remarkable case, with its overwhelming evidence that after every medical expert who examined Miranda had said that she was bound to die, spiritual healing proved them to be completely wrong. On one occasion, when visiting Fricker's sanctuary, I saw Miranda, who looked a picture of fun-loving health and vigor. No one would believe that she was once doomed to die. End of chapter. Chapter 14. He Always Makes News. When, as editor of a weekly psychic newspaper, I read the first account of Fricker's healing printed in local newspaper, I wondered whether he was, in journalistic parlance, a story. By nature, members of my profession are skeptical. Our work gives us a behind-scenes insight into human nature with all its foibles and eccentricities. Too often we are confronted with a publicity seeker whose vanity is flattered by seeing his name in print. Then there are the many who have exaggerated opinions about their powers and cannot understand why they are not in the limelight. Besides, an editor's job is not to publicize but to print the news, that human material which, because it is different, makes everyone want to read about it. I sent an experienced reporter down to interview Fricker and to watch him at work. I want the facts, I said. Is he as remarkable as the local newspaper's account suggests? Is he one of the hundreds of the run-of-the-mill healers doing excellent but unspectacular work, or has he got that extra something which will make him news? The reporter, after his first visit, told me that he was not sure. The claims of cures being made were so extraordinary that he would like to check them by interviewing some of the patients before anything was printed. A week later he telephoned with some excitement, a little unusual for a hard-boiled reporter. There was no doubt in his mind that Fricker was news and would continue to be news. Naturally, my publication of the reporter's account brought a tremendous flood of application to Fricker from the vast army of hopeless cases who turned to him as eagerly as Muslims make their pilgrimage to Mecca. Thereafter I received a steady stream of letters from grateful patients anxious to have the stories of their cures known. Very soon we had to be selective as to which letters were published simply because there would be a monotony in the sameness of reporting cures. The selection was narrowed down to those who had the little something different to justify publication. I do not propose to weary you with the recital of all these letters, even though they are indicative of the tremendous contribution Fricker has made, and is making, towards lifting the burden from a sick humanity. The first in 1956 came from a woman who had been crippled with arthritis in her left knee with pain so unbearable that she could manage to crawl about only with the aid of a stick. After 5 visits she joyfully announced she was walking quite well again. The pain and stiffness had gone. She had discarded her stick and was doing her chores and shopping in comfort. In the same issue there was a letter from a man who began by saying that in 1952 he was invalided from the Royal Navy because of a duodenal ulcer. Ever since he had been in great pain and lived mostly on boiled fish and milk. After one visit to Fricker, he was told that the ulcer had gone and he could eat anything. The advice he had followed, including the eating of many fried meals which hitherto had been rigidly banned, yet he had experienced no pain. He ended his letter with these words, "My only regret is I do not know of Mr. Fricker's great healing power years ago." Next came the testimony of a man who previously could hardly walk because of a slipped disc. In agony he dragged himself to a telephone box to speak to Fricker. The healer saw him that evening and relieved most of his pain with one treatment. Now he testified his pain had entirely disappeared, and so had a slipped disc. A month later there was praise for a woman who used to sit with her hands over her eyes because she could not bear the light of her ulcerated lids. Every time she visited hospitals for treatment her quest was in vain. The ulcers always returned. The effect on her health was disastrous. She heard of Fricker, visited him, and her health troubles were over. No longer did she have to hide her face from the light. This issue also contained the testimony of a 14-year-old girl who had been sent home from school after severe attacks of migraine. For 3 years she had been under the care of doctors, but the migraine persisted. Now she was no longer sent home from school. Fricker's hands banished the migraine and turned her into a bright and happy teenager. The fourth testimony, that same week, came from a man suffering with that dreaded disease, osteoarthritis, in which the cartilage and bone become wholly or partly destroyed. There was no doubt about the affliction, for a year earlier it had been confirmed in X-rays. All the doctors could do to help him was to prescribe pain-killing drugs. He visited Fricker, and almost immediately I found I was free of pain. Soon I was announcing that Fricker was a man you can't keep out of the news. This time it was a reader's verdict that the duodenal ulcer which had been torturing him for 17 years was no longer there because of what he called his amazing cure. Here again there could be no suggestion of a mistaken diagnosis because of the ulcer's existence was confirmed by X-ray examination to hospital. Though I have the highest respect, faith, and admiration for doctors, I have had only brief periods of relief during all these years, he said. A friend as a last resort recommended him to try Fricker. He went with an open mind with little hope of faith. At the first treatment the pain stopped. Just like turning off a dripping tap, I felt immensely relieved and almost speechless. Where previously had been an intense pain, there was only a slight soreness. After 6 more visits he was completely cured, proved by the fact that he, like so many others, was now able to consume foods that had hitherto been denied him. There was also the testimony of another migraine sufferer who had waited 12 months before writing to me just to test the efficiency of his cure. He was also troubled with very high blood pressure. Without disclosing to his doctor where he had been, he submitted himself for examination. The surprised doctor told him that he was virtually back to normal in all respect. "I do not know what you have been doing," he said, "but even if you have been standing on your head for 2 hours daily, you must keep up the treatment." There was, however, no more treatment to be maintained, for Fricker had cured him. Now it was the turn of a patient for whom an operation was averted, one of the many thousands for which Fricker is now responsible. Her story was prefaced with the announcement, "It's hard to keep pace with the cures achieved by Fricker, the fantastic healer," the nickname we had deservedly conferred on him. After being x-rayed, which revealed gallstones, her doctor advised an operation because of her constant agony. Instead of the operation, she had a few treatments from Fricker. "I was amazed," she said, using a word that constantly recurs in verdicts from patients. "Before, I had to go on strict diet and lost 1.5 stone in 4 months. Now the diet was over, and she had put on nearly 2 stone. 6 months later, the letters were coming in at such a rate that I decided to use the best of them in a whole-page account. This largely featured cures of slipped discs and ulcers, the 2 complaints in which he was always specializing. Every time I have visited his sanctuary, I have seen grateful patients leaving with their indispensable spinal belts and supports wrapped up in parcels never to be used again and to be kept as souvenirs of the healing. I quote only one of the cases mentioned in this whole-page account. It concerned a woman with a slipped disc, which had resulted in her having so stiff a neck that the hospital made her wear a collar around it. It was a temporary fitting, she was told, but they would supply her with a permanent replacement on her next visit, and she would have to wear it for 3 months. Her condition was complicated by severe pain and numbness in her right arm, a condition that had first sent her to the hospital. She never returned to it. Fricker removed the temporary collar and gave her one treatment which restored full mobility of the neck and banished all pain and discomfort. In describing her cure and to illustrate the speed of his healing, we use for the first time a phrase that has since been often repeated: "Fricker is quicker." The following month it was the turn of a former polio victim to describe the wonderful improvement in her condition. Before visiting Fricker, she had always had to go down steps backwards and slowly. Now she was able to walk a little way. Because of her improvement, she knew that her cure was not far distant. Though I had imposed upon myself the necessity to print only outstanding cases, a week later Fricker was in the news again, this time with a cure of asthma after 30 years. The patient said that he had to be persuaded to visit Fricker, yet the attacks, which had been severe, finished after his first treatment, and there was also a vast improvement in his general health condition. His verdict is worthy of a place in this book. I have not had the slightest sign of any asthma attack or any inconvenience from hay fever and catarrh, 2 of the maladies always present when I was not actually experiencing asthma. All the statements I have made can be checked and confirmed by my own doctor, who has attended me for the past 25 years without relieving my condition in the slightest. A week later, Fricker was again in the news. This time, a reader announced that his wife, a victim of asthma for nearly 15 years, had astonished her friends by the sprightly way that she now went about her business, freed from any further bouts since she placed herself in Fricker's hands a few months earlier. Hers was a double cure, for she had also suffered with that terrible skin ailment, psoriasis, which had covered her body, arms, and legs for the last 9 years. The healing had succeeded in driving out the psoriasis from the body and arms, and only the left leg showed any trace of the disease, which was gradually fading. Yet after they had spent a small fortune, doctors had said there was no permanent cure. Looking at the cuttings again, after all these years, it begins to read like a catalogue of cures. A miracle of healing is a phrase used by a husband to describe his wife's cure, not only of a slipped disc, but also of chronic arthritis, with the result that she was a transformed woman, with her youthful looks and vigor restored. My amazing cure is how another reader summed up his case after he had endured 14 years of unsuccessful hospital treatment for severe varicose eczema on both legs. He had to stop work for 2 years and could hardly walk because of the great pain. According to the doctors, he was a hopeless case. They were puzzled when they examined him after the healing, for there was no trace of his affliction. His cure was proved by the fact that I have now been back at work for 3 months as an engineer's bench fitter. So the story goes on: jaundice, paralysis, and also blindness. When the sight of a young housewife was restored by Fricker, she declared, "What has happened to me is a miracle. Only the power of God could have made it happen." Now it was the turn of a woman whose 2 years of agony had resulted in suicidal tendencies. Hers was a mystery illness which crippled her as she steadily became worse, dreading each succeeding X-ray examination. One day she was told that trouble lay in her spine. Another time it was changed to being a complication in her blood. She was driven by a car to Fricker, lifted out of it, and carried into the sanctuary, powerless to move. Within a few minutes, all pain vanished and movement was restored to her legs. She was able to walk out to the car and to get in unaided after having demonstrated her cure by touching her toes. Her essential steel corset was discarded and never since been worn. It was the most wonderful moment in my life, she said, as she described with tears of joy the surprise of which the family greeted her on her return home. I content myself by referring to a recent case because it concerned a 9-month-old baby for whom a delicate eye operation was averted. I mention this case because it was a third cure in one family. The baby's father had been cured of a duodenal ulcer and his mother-in-law of a slipped disc. The child's trouble began when 10 weeks old with a complaint caused by bacteria in her right eye, which swelled like a boil and periodically discharged. A stay in a hospital for 6 weeks produced no improvement. The doctor's verdict was that an operation would have to be undergone, but this was not advisable until the baby was at least a year old. Meanwhile, the parents were advised that medically nothing could be done, but wait and to bathe the affected eye as often as possible. This was a sad blow for the mother because she saw her child's growth gradually being retarded. She seemed to be just wasting away, she said. Fricker's first treatment produced a marked improvement. With each visit, the infection decreased. Finally, a complete cure was effected with the last visit, which happened to be the mother's birthday. Could I have had a more wonderful present, she asked. The child was taken to see the same doctors who had previously treated her in the hospital and were told about Fricker's healing. At first they showed no interest, contenting themselves with saying, "Well, it's your baby," as if to suggest they had disapproved. Grudgingly, however, they had to acknowledge that improvement was taking place. After Fricker had announced that the cure was accomplished, the baby once more was taken to the hospital where the doctors discharged her. End of chapter. Chapter 15. The Happiest Man in the World. Though he lives almost daily in an atmosphere of pain, sickness, and suffering, light relief is occasionally provided. One day when I called at the sanctuary, I found that a patient was accompanied by his doctor, who was skeptical about the healing. Fricker, confident as always, had raised no objection to the medical man being present when the patient had requested it. It was another slip disc case, and the doctor had come because his patient had insisted on Fricker treating him. The medico decided to impose a test. "Where is a slip disc?" he asked. Without hesitation, Fricker pointed to the exact spot in the patient's spine. Grudgingly, the doctor agreed that he was right. Now he waited critically as Fricker did his usual treatment and then pronounced the oft-repeating words, "You are cured." The doctor went through the ritual of testing the cure by making his patients do all the things that had hitherto been impossible and were now easy. No longer was he a skeptic. He asked if he could talk to some of the waiting patients, and each case was told by them of how medical treatment had proved unavailing. Finally he returned to Fricker and said, "I have a request to make. Will you treat one of my cases, which is medically hopeless?" The wheel had turned full circle. Fricker always delights to heal children. There was one 4-year-old girl who insisted on coming to see him each week, even after she was cured. "I want to give you healing," she said, and she did, miming his treatment. I like the story of a patient who was worried as he sat in the waiting room, where she could hear the strains of the radiogram playing a modern popular song. She turned to Fricker's daughter, who was then acting as secretary, and said, "I hope that doesn't mean I'm expected to dance, because I cannot." The daughter replied, "Well, neither can my father." At 11:45 p.m. one night, the healer was surprised to hear a ring at his front door. He went to investigate. "I have an appointment for healing," said the caller, and produced a letter to confirm his statement. "That is a typing error for 11:45 a.m., said Fricker. Whereupon the caller said, "My wife said it was a mistake, but I assumed you were so busy that it was the only time you could fit me in." One of the difficulties confronting the healer is the overwhelming gratitude of his patients, which they try to express in all sorts of ways. There was a woman who regularly produced, after treatment, 4 fillets of fish brought from the shop in which she worked, knowing that Fricker enjoyed them for his supper. One night he looked at the table and asked his wife, "Where's the fish?" "Well, there is no more," she answered. "You have cured her." When Fricker told me this story, I said jokingly, "You should have spun out the cure and had the fish." On another occasion I was pulling his leg about all the religious objects, the gifts of thankful patients which adorn his sanctuary. I suggested that some of them might repel visitors of other faith, particularly Orthodox Jewish sufferers who come because they live in nearby districts. The healer turned the tables on me by saying, "That is all right. In the kitchen we have matzahs, unleavened bread eaten at the Passover festival, and a copy of the Jewish Chronicle." Geraldine Lady Straboli, after reading a book by one Professor Wade Boggs, in which he criticized spirit healers because he regarded them as outside the Christian pale, questioned Fricker on this matter. She was suffering from an obscure eye disease for which she desperately sought the healer's help. From his hands, placed directly on her eyes, came a powerful vibration, though his fingers did not move. "What is this vibration?" she asked. "It's a healing ray," he replied. "Yes," she said. "I know it is a healing my eyes, but can you tell me more about it?" This brought one of Fricker's typical simple answers. "It comes from God," he said, whereupon Geraldine commented, "My eyes are cured," and that to me was the whole answer. I commend it to Professor Boggs. Teresa, the youngest daughter of Fricker and his first cure, blushed when her mother revealed her secret. Every night Teresa prayed for all the patients who visited her father. It was a reader from the north of England who told me this story. He had come to London to visit Fricker. At Manor House Station, the nearest of the Underground Railway, he said to a group of taxi drivers that he wanted to go to 40 Howard Street. Though he had mentioned no name, one driver said, "That's the man we have just been talking about." Asked why, he explained that with other drivers he was used to taking people to the healer. That morning his fare had been a man who could hardly walk, looked very ill, and was obviously great in pain. When he had set down the patient, the taximan cruised around and then waited in the hope of bringing the fare back. Soon the man came out of the house, but the driver could hardly believe what he saw. The patient was walking very well, looked younger and cheerful, a complete contrast in 30 minutes. The cabman was so astonished at this transformation that he engaged his fare in conversation, learning from him how he had been speedily healed. So he was arranging to take his wife because she needed healing. Evadine Price, whose cure I had already mentioned in this book, answered cautiously when a man in a railway compartment asked, "Do you know anything about healing?" After a little hesitation she answered, "What kind of healing?" "Spirit healing," said the man. "I have heard you talk about it in public." Then a woman, the only other occupant of the compartment, interposed. "Well, that is odd. My husband has just been cured of a slipped disc from which he had been suffering for 15 years. I have the healer's name in my handbag." She produced a card. It had Fricker's name on it. A patient who arrived for a second treatment was asked, "How are you today?" by Fricker, who was surprised with the answer. "All my pains have gone, but I don't feel a bit better." The cemetery is the last place in which you would think there would be a conversation about this healer. I had gone to Putney Crematorium to conduct a funeral service of a spiritualist. Afterwards, I went to the superintendent's office to sign the register. On his desk I noticed a copy of Two Worlds, which I added. I asked the reason for its presence. He told me that a few days earlier he had been in great pain and discomfort, a fact noted by the vicar who regularly conducts funeral service at his crematorium. In response to the vicar's inquiry, the superintendent said that his trouble was that modern menace, a slipped disc. "We can put that right," said the vicar, who took him to Fricker. He ended the trouble in a matter of seconds. The vicar was none other than Reverend John Pierce Higgins, who makes no secret of his psychic convictions. Later I spotted him at the crematorium and mentioned the superintendent's cure. "Well, I often take patients to Fricker," he said. I must include in this chapter the story that always makes me smile when I think of it. It concerns the editor of a national newspaper who, after featuring some of Fricker's remarkable cures, telephoned to ask for my help. "I have a spot of a brother at home," he said. "My wife, after reading in the newspaper about these cures, wants to know why her mother cannot go to Fricker for her trouble. Needless to say, she went. I have already told you that almost every known complaint has yielded to Fricker's healing. When patients arrive suffering from simple ailments like influenza, he tells them to go to their doctor. It is not part of his function to have medical men eliminated from the therapeutic field. Nevertheless, he is puzzled by their attitude. They behave as our grandfather might have done if they were told about the television that we now accept as commonplace," he said. This always made him sad. "What," I asked him, "made you happy?" "It is the fact that he lives in a kind of wonderland as he sees the success of the healing. Sometimes I feel it is a dream and I will wake up," he said. "It has made me the happiest man in the world knowing that I can help sufferers." End of chapter. Chapter 16, An Offer to Doctors. Now I have come to the end of my task, even though Fricker has not come to the end of his. This book is an attempt to give you a picture of the man and his mission, which still continues. It is a story of an individual endowed by God with a gift which has made him dedicate his life to the most beneficent of all tasks, bringing health to many thousands of sufferers. Orthodox clergymen and hidebound doctors may not be pleased at the fact that the Almighty, in His wisdom, has conferred this gift on someone outside their profession, but the ways of God are not the ways of man. It is perhaps a salutary reminder that the monopoly of divine power cannot be possessed by any church or calling. Whatever the opposition, it must in the end be worn down simply because of the ever-growing number of successes, despite all the excuses, pretexts, and evasions, the alleged mistaken diagnosis, and the pathetic explanation that their recovery was natural and spontaneous. Fricker provides evidence that spirit power, divine in its origin, is still at work today, just as it was in Bible days. Truly, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is always ready to cooperate, but obviously can do nothing if doctors refuse to cooperate with him. Right at the beginning of his ministry, when his early cures were achieving local publicity, he announced, "I am willing to spend 2 or 3 weeks at a hospital treating patients. I certainly cannot do any harm. I only lay my hands on the patients." His offer was never accepted. He repeats it once more and is ready to demonstrate his gift to any doctor or group of medical men. Secretly, he has cooperated with receptive doctors whose names cannot be disclosed because it might lead to them being struck off the medical register. It is a sad commentary on official medicine that it would mete out this terrible punishment to doctors who send patients to a healer who cures their hopeless cases. You would have thought that even the medical citadel would welcome any means by which the word incurable is abolished and health is restored to sufferers. Alas, it is not so. This, however, is a line with opposition to pioneers throughout the ages. It is not confined to medicine, which has its own sad tale to relate of obliquely heaped even on doctors who produce results by unconventional means. Who has not heard of the hostility shown by doctors towards Simpson and Lister, and many other names that could be cited? So far as Fricker is concerned, the work goes on unceasingly, day after day. It began in obscurity and humble surroundings, because one man had evidence of his divine gift. Where it will end I know not, and neither does he. My experience in these matters is a long one, for it now embraces 40 years. Because of it, I have long ceased to be dogmatic and to declare that results can be achieved only by certain methods. We are dealing with a power that is invisible, intangible, and imponderable, but nevertheless real, as is constantly demonstrated. We cannot measure it. We cannot impel it to go to any direction. It operates according to its own laws with which we are as yet unfamiliar. Every time I visit Fricker's sanctuary, I leave enthused and heartened at the magnificent work that is being done. It is hallowed ground, made sacred because the power of God is operating therein. Behind the surface, a mighty organization of invisibles that work, bringing its benediction to sufferers who come from many lands and who should be spiritually better as a result. The physical healing, tremendously important though it is secondary to the spiritual lessons which all sufferers should learn. If they are healed and do not know the reason why, or fail to understand the vital implications, then there may have been a success in one direction but a failure in another. The healing, in my view, is part of a divine plan to awaken mankind to eternal realities, to the realization that here and now we are all spiritual beings. We are born with a spiritual heritage and have a spiritual destiny to achieve. Fricker's labors are part of that plan. He is privileged to be its instrument. Long may he continue to serve in the field in which he has acquitted himself so well. His future is full of glorious possibilities. End of chapter, end of book. This audio presentation of I Hear a Voice, a biography of E.G. Fricker the Healer, by Maurice Barbanal, has been brought to you by audioenlightenment.com. Copyright 2013, all rights reserved.